can y'all see the slides all right? It's pretty clear.
Can we make the slides darker at all?
I guess there's not much lighting right here.
Can you see the slides okay up there? Okay. Okay.
I think so.
Okay, so it's 9 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is session number 38, Man Training for Individuals with Autism, a review of the literature and some recommendations for practice with Sarah Lachago. I do have a couple of just housekeeping announcements first before I introduce her. On Monday, during the main opening session, it was announced about the Children's Institute play on Friday. The information was correct or has been revised. So if you're interested in going to the play on Friday, it's at 2:45 in room 108. That's the children's play. We are pleased to announce that this is a green conference. We do not have a QR code scan, as you might have seen when you came in for this session. However, the PowerPoint is up on the website, so you can easily bring that up on any device. The exhibit hall is open today from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Every day, the following rooms will be devoted to quiet time. It's rooms 115 and 116. Today, our special event is the poster session, Art of Expression exhibit, and a reception, which includes a cash bar in the Dean's Hall. I will be announcing the code at the end of the session so that you're able to put that in your information. So, our speaker today is Dr. Sarah Lachago. She's currently an assistant professor in the General Psychology and Behavior Analysis Master's Program at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. She graduated with her PhD in Behavior Analysis from Western Michigan University in May of 2009. She was assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and in the Applied Behavior Analysis Master's Program at Florida State University, Panama City for 2 years, from 2008 to 2010. While there, she was director of the FSU PC Early Childhood Autism Program and the executive chair of the Emerald Coast Association for Behavior Analysis. Sarah serves as the Student Research Proposal Grant Competition Coordinator and Website Manager of the Verbal Behavior Special Interest Group of the Association for Behavior Analysis. She is on the Board of Reviewers for the Analysis of Verbal Behavior and serves as a guest reviewer for the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis and Education and Treatment of Children. Her research interests include motivating operations, verbal behavior, social skills trainer, and caregiver teacher training. Sarah supervises behavior analysis graduate students in the school setting in the area of autism treatment. She is currently developing a language development clinic that will be affiliated with UHCLO's Center for Autism Developmental Disabilities.
It's open already.
Sorry?
It's already open.
Oh, and it's open.
Yes,
Yay.
as of 2011.
Yay, great, congratulations.
Thanks, man.
And Sarah is new to our conference, and we are very excited to have her become a part of it this year. So without further ado, Sarah.
Thanks. All right, thank you. No one ever wants to sit in the front row, ever. Not even, I was just saying, not even in my classes I get. I don't bite most of the time. It's all right. We can move on. So I would like to survey my audience a little bit. Who in here is a parent of a child with autism? So I've got one parent. And master's level practitioners? Okay. Speech pathologists? Speech folks. Okay, and then there's some other in there. Okay. All right. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hi. Of course. Of course. All right. Well, I'm very excited. I like talking about mans and MOs a whole lot. I'm going to talk about that today, and I'm going to do my very best to stay on track because I can get off track very easily when it comes to this. So here's how I want to do this. I want to keep this a little bit. I want to keep it relatively casual. So if you have a question, pop your hand up. And at any time during the presentation. I'm going to present for a while. I'm going to give you a 15-minute break about halfway through because no one should have to sit in one spot for 3 hours. yeah, we'll go from there. Okay? Sound good? Yes. Okay. Is everybody awake? Had some caffeine, some food. All right. Good. All right. So again, today I'm going to be talking about mans, and that's a pretty broad topic. I was asked to do a literature review as well, which is also super broad. That's a pretty robust research-based. So this is what we're going to do today. I'm going to review the current literature on man training. And so what I mean by current is anywhere from 2000 to the present. And then I'm going to review techniques for teaching mans. And then I'm also going to do a lit review and give recommendations for teaching mans for information. And mans for information, they are mans, and we'll talk about that and we'll define those terms. But I wanted to give special attention to mans for information because clinically, what I see when I consult is a lot of errors in the way people set up those training sessions. So we're going to talk about that. Okay. So that is our agenda for today. So first, let's define our terms. I'm going to talk about mans, which is a verbal operant under the influence of a relevant motivating operation and which specifies its reinforcer. Right? So in other words, it's basically what we know as a request. But the most important thing here is that it is under the influence of a motivating operation. Now, who has heard these terms before, is familiar with Skinner's analysis? Okay, so I'm talking about things you guys have heard before. Okay, good. Great. If you have not read this paper, read this paper. This is a paper by Sundberg and Michael, and they talked about the benefits of Skinner's analysis in teaching verbal behavior. It's a phenomenal paper, and I can't see very well, so I'm going to turn around and read it. And what they recommend in this paper is that a man be the primary and initial target in an early and intensive behavioral intervention program. And I want you to take note of this highlighted part right here. They write, said another way, mans directly benefit the speaker by producing access to desired, often unconditioned reinforcers. The other verbal operants, while certainly important, do not have this type of immediate benefit. And they write, from the perspective of Skinner's analysis, it would be quite reasonable for man training to be the major focus of early language training. The other types of verbal behavior should not be neglected, but it is the man that gives the child some control over the social and indirectly the non-social environment. This control should increase the value to the child of language training in general, which in turn should make the task of language training, the language trainer, an easier one. And this is very impactful for me because before I started graduate school, I was a therapist in a place where we didn't take Skinner's approach to teaching language. And so we were doing these tact training programs with these children, and I had children who could tact. Now, I don't know if you don't know what a tact is, that's just labeling. They could tact like 100, some of them 200 pictures, a compass, spatula, hairbrush. But if they needed help, a break, food, they couldn't ask for it. And so it seems to me it was more like I call it a parlor trick. It's like, yeah, I have a kid who, when shown a picture, can utter a word that we will differentially reinforce as the verbal behavior community, but it was not functional to the child. And so this made a lot of sense. It's like, yeah, why don't I start off with something that actually has importance, that brings benefit, immediate benefit to my learner? So this is why we start with a man. This is why it's critically important to go there first. So when teaching the man, there is something to be said for motivation. Motivation is absolutely key. So as we talked about before, the man is an operant that must be trained and probed under the influence of the MO. So of course, we talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk a lot about the MO, but this is another paper. So throughout the presentation, all of them are going to be snapshots of papers I think you need to read. This is just the easiest way to give you the citation right here. You must read this paper if you haven't already. This was a concept when Skinner first talked about mans. He talked about them in terms of being under the influence of some sort of aversive stimulation or level of deprivation. And then sometimes they are. So if I'm food deprived, I might man for food. But there are other types of mans. You want other things. So These concepts have been refined over time. Keller and Schoenfeld introduced the concept of the establishing operation. Then Jack Michael came along and he introduced the concept of condition motivating operations, or fleshed that concept out more fully, right? Because most of our MOs are conditioned. In other words, there are things that we're taught to want, right? So I went to grad school, I wanted a PhD. Well, I wasn't necessarily born with that. I was taught that that was valuable. So it's a conditioned MO. Does that make sense? Okay. And then Laraway and his colleagues wrote this paper in which they further refined the terms and conceptualization of the way we think about MANs and motivating operations. And so this is the way they define it. An MO is an environmental event, operation, or stimulus condition that affects an organism's behavior by altering the reinforcing or punishing effectiveness of other environmental events and the frequency of occurrence of that part of the organism's repertoire relevant to those events as consequences. And then, of course, there's the establishing operation, the abolishing operation, unconditioned motivating operations, condition motivating operations, and within condition motivating operations you have reflexive condition motivating operations, transitive condition motivating operations, and surrogate motivating operations. You got it down? Or does it feel a little bit like this when people talk about MOs? Yeah, it's its own area. I could talk about MOs for hours. I love them. We don't need to worry about all of this today. This is what I want you to think about when you think about MOs today. An MO has two primary effects. It has a value-altering effect, right? It influences whether something functions as a reinforcer. It also influences whether something functions as a punisher, right? So I have a history. I love going to shows, live music shows, right? So there's usually an MO there. Friday night, I have some money. There's a good show going on. There's an MO to go see it. But I have a migraine that is, it establishes loud music as a punisher. Do you see that? So it's fluid, right? If you think about motivation, it's very fluid. All I want you guys to think about today, though, I want you to think about it just in terms of the reinforcer because we're relating it to the demand, okay? And then the second effect is that it's a behavior-altering effect, right? In that it increases behavior that's produced those reinforcers in the past. Nice and simple, right? So let's look at an example. If you're water deprived or you're thirsty, the value-altering effect comes in that it establishes, for example, water as a reinforcer, right? You're thirsty, water suddenly functions as a reinforcer, and then it alters behavior, it produces behavior that's produced water in the past. Yes. That's amazing, isn't it? Does that make sense? Those two aspects of the MO, those are two important aspects. You've got your value altering and your behavior altering, right? So when it comes to manned training, I want you to just think about contriving the MO in a few simple ways. You want to make sure that you're going to use preferred items or activities when you teach. That seems commonsensical, but you would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, how people do not do this sometimes. And you must, so there's two things. Work with your learner. Make sure you actually use something that matters, right, or that's desirable to your learner. And here's the key, reinforce with that item, because a man specifies its own reinforcer. Right? So if I say water, then the reinforcer isn't just, good job, and I give you a gummy bear, right? What is it? Yes, you mouthed it. Very good. I'm going to differentially reinforce speaking behavior. So I'm going to shape it up. If it's just a mouth, I'm going to start right there. Very good. It's water. All right. So what I'm going to do, again, I was told, they said, can you just do a lit review of the manned literature? And I don't know if any of you delved into the manned literature. I did it because I love it and I did it for you. And it's robust and it's big and it's beefy. And there is no way in 3 hours, if I had to also give recommendations, that I could that I could do a complete lit review. And I also just think it would be a little bit cumbersome to do that. So this is what I did. I thought about two things. What I used as my sort of motivation, or to inspire me in terms of what papers to select were the questions that I get asked most frequently in my clinic by other caregivers, teachers, and parents. What are the things that people really want to know and need help with? And I also selected papers that I think best translate directly to practice. So these are the ones that I think that you can take from paper to practice, because I'm assuming is it fair to say that's what you're here for? You want to come, you want me to tell you, this is what it says, go do this? Okay, because that's what I was thinking about. But there certainly is a lot of other research literature related to man training, and if you're interested, I can give you my email address, you can pop me an email, and I can send you all those articles. It's a very interesting literature base. All right. So this is a study conducted by Hartman and Klatt, and they looked at just this, the deprivation, pre-session exposure and preferences in teaching manning to children with autism. And so in this study, they had two boys, about 2.5 years old, both diagnosed with autism. They could echo a few words, but they could not man for items. They could not tact either, or label, or receptively identify items before training. So these are pretty fresh new students. And so this is what they did. They just compared they manipulated the MO in two ways. One, they did a preference assessment, and they identified different levels of preference. So highly preferred, moderately preferred, and the least preferred items. Still preferred, but the least preferred items. So they wanted to look at that in terms of how it affects man's training. And then they looked at levels of deprivation. So in one condition, the learner was deprived for 23 hours prior of the items that they were using to teach. And then in the other condition, they gave the learner pre-session exposure. So they let them play with the item or consume the item for 5 minutes beforehand. Okay? And so here are the outcomes. Okay. So we're looking here for Sean. Now if you look at can you see this? Oh, so they can't see the arrow. Okay, well, look at the top panel. These are the outcomes for Sean. Across the x-axis, we have sessions, and the y-axis, you have cumulative number of correct trials. Now, if you look at the top panel, this is where they're comparing responding under the different levels of preference for items. And not surprisingly, he had most acquisition, the highest rate of acquisition under the highly preferred items. Now, there was still acquisition with the other items, which is really good. It wasn't significantly different, but there was still greater levels or greater sort of a higher rate of acquisition for preferred items. But look at the bottom panel. This is where they're comparing levels of deprivation. And as you can see, for the 23-hour deprivation, there was a big difference with respect to acquisition, rate of acquisition, wasn't there? Right? There's a greater rate of acquisition when they were deprived, or he was deprived. Now we look at our next participant. This is Billy. Look at the top for Billy. Look how preference affects Billy's responding, much more than Sean. So for Billy, it made a big difference to do that structured preference assessment and identify the most preferred item in terms of rate of acquisition. And if you look at levels of deprivation, here, yes, there was greater acquisition when he was deprived for 23 hours, but the greater difference was related to preference. So the take-home point here is, not only do you have to think about really identifying preferred items, as you can see they make a difference, but also how deprived are you, is your learner of those items. Does that make sense? So, I'm sure you've come across this before where we've worked with clients. We've identified, for example, Oreo cookies as a preferred item. I get to the house, and his face is caked in Oreo cookies. And I have that moment, oh no. So what have you been doing? Well, he's been at his Oreos. Doesn't matter if it's preferred. If he's been, chowing down on them for the last half hour, I don't really have much. All right. In this next study, Sweeney and Kerwin wanted to transfer control of the man to the MO. So oftentimes, when we're teaching MOs or teaching mans, we're teaching with the item, usually start with the teaching with the item present, is that right? So you usually kind of do what do you want? And you tell them how to name the item. And so what they wanted to do in this study is they wanted it to come solely under the control of the MO, which is something that people need to think about. Because you don't want your learner only manning for item in the presence of the items. Right? So the participants were two young boys with autism. One was vocal, the other one used signs because he had very poor articulation. And they wanted to just look at the frequency of what they called MO-controlled mans, right? That's mans that occurred at least 15 seconds after the desired item had just been displayed and consumed, and that occurs without the item present, okay? And they used this procedure called a rolling time delay to bring the man under control of the motivating operation. Okay, and I'm sure some of you probably used something similar in the past. So what this means is in the first session, they had the targeted item in view, and if the child emitted the man, they'd give the child a little bit of the item, a small amount. They'd count that as what's called a multiply controlled man, which is good. That's fine. Then they get a 2-minute time delay. If the man occurred within 2 minutes, but after 15 seconds of the item removal, then they call that an MO-controlled man. And if there's no man, then the item was represented and they got it under multiple control. So they kept on doing this. Okay, the kid would ask, gummy bear, here you go, and then in the absence of the item. Right? And so what they did is they would just give him 30 minutes with the item not present, or the item manned. They just had the item hidden for the rest of the 30-minute session. Right? They also tested for generalization and maintenance across 4 instructors. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so here's what we have. Across the x-axis right here, we have sessions and the frequency of MO-controlled mans per session. And so as you can see in baseline, none of the mans are occurring in the absence of the item. Right? That's not uncommon. And then you see in the next phase, the rolling prompt delay. And as you can see now, we have mans occurring, right? Under the influence of the MO, and then when they probe for generalization, we have mans under the influence of the MO. This one's my favorite, one of my favorite studies right here. So I'm sure some of you, have you ever worked with individuals using a picture exchange communication system or a card system? Okay. Now essentially, oftentimes what you're doing is you're teaching mans at first. That's what you're doing. You're taking preferred items and they're going to give you a response and you're going to reinforce that response with the item itself. But there are some interesting considerations that you have to take into account when you're teaching using picture cards. And one of the things you have to make sure is that they actually are discriminating between the cards. Does that make sense? So if we have children who are giving me cards, if I give them just cards of preferred items, and they're giving me a card, and I give them the item, they're probably just going to take the item. Even if, they meant Cheeto, and I give them gummy bear, they're probably going to be pretty good with that as well. But that's a problem. I want to make sure that I actually have a learner that's responding is under discriminative control of the demand, right? So I can't just go up to you, mean that I want gummy bears, and go, water, right? It's the same thing. We have to teach them to respond appropriately using cards. So in this study, they had a participant, his name was Luke, who's 8 years old, microcephaly, Cornelia de Lange syndrome, ADHD, and they wanted to look at the number of responses or percentage of responses and then selection of high preference items, medium preference items, low preference items, and control items. And this, I think, was very, very clever. So they used a pair choice preference assessment to identify highly, moderately, least preferred items and control items. Control items are neutral items, one that it doesn't affect them, it makes no difference to them. And so what they did is they would present the cards to reinforce two cards that represented preferred items and one control card, and then they would just give them the consequences associated with the card. So if you give me a gummy bear item or card, I would give you a gummy bear. And then they did an analysis where they wanted to compare, and this was to verify, they did an analysis using motivating operations to verify that the learner was actually distinguishing between cards. So you have learners that are using cards, and you haven't determined quite yet whether their responding is under discriminative control of the cards. This might be a nice way to assess that discriminative responding. So they did what's called the high preference versus low preference analysis, medium preference or moderate preference to low preference, and a high preference to moderate preference. Okay. And these are the outcomes. is what's so interesting to me. So let's start. We have sessions across the x-axis and percentage of trials across the y. Now, let's just take a look at the top panel. Now, what you see in the top panel, so I don't have a pointer. I thought maybe the arrow would be visible. So if you look at the top panel, what you'll see is that the open triangles denote sort of the least preference, and then the closed diamonds denote high preference items. Now, you'll note that after baseline, you'll see RI. This means response independent. Next to it, HP. So what that means is that they're giving the learner just free access every once in a while to the item without having to engage in a response. Now, here's the idea. If I give you free access to something that you really like, that means, and you like something more than something else that's available, that means you're probably not going to ask me for much, right? You shouldn't be, because you have access to the thing that you really like. And so as you can see, under RIHP, there's very little responding. There's no card exchange, just a little bit for the high preference item. But then in the next condition, they have the response independent delivery, the low preference item, right? Again, denoted by the open triangles. Look what happens. The child says, no, I don't want that, and starts exchanging like crazy for the highly preferred item. So what are we verifying here? You know the difference between these two things, right? This is a very, very clever assessment, a very good way of using motivating operation, assessing preference. So look, we go back to the response-independent high preference. What happens? Responding bottoms out, or nearly bottoms out for both of them. Reverse back to low preference. The kid's like, nope, I don't want this thing, I want that thing. Exchange for the card, and then a nice control at the end, a control, the least preferred versus control card, and what does he exchange for? The least preferred item, because presumably he's going to like that or prefer that over the neutral item. Right? It's a nice little verification at the end. Then they decide to replicate and say, what does this look like when we have moderately preferred against least preferred? And as you can see, in baseline are selecting the moderately preferred item, as we would expect. Then the response-independent delivery of the medium preferred item in the second condition there. And not much delivery or exchange of the cards, right? Now we get a response-independent delivery of the least preferred item, and what does he give the card for? The moderately preferred item. Again, verifying for us, like, oh no, you can tell the difference between these things, right? Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about this one? This was a very nice, clean, simple way to make sure, does my learner know the difference between, because these are his or her words. So you need to make sure that he or she's using those words correctly in a sense. And they went on to just replicate these effects again. They did even high preference against moderately preferred. And you see in baseline, they're giving the high preference card more. And when they response independent delivery of the high preference item, there's no exchange because the kid has what he wants. Then they do a response independent delivery of the moderately preferred. And what happens? Nice exchange there for the highly preferred item. And so on and so forth. All right. Now, in this study, O'Reilly and his colleagues looked at the effects of MO on the maintenance of man. So people tend to, sometimes people can be very good at, like, when I'm teaching them, they think very clearly about, yes, I got to make sure I'm using preferred items or doing what I need to do, make sure the MO is present. But when they do follow-ups in terms of checking for, like, generalization or MANs, sometimes people forget to ensure that the MO is still there. And this was a really nice study. These 3 children, diagnosed with autism, they were focusing on man frames. So they were focusing on, can I have item name? And they just looked at the independent variable, or what they looked at is just EO manipulation, right? So they had, they compared, let's look at these data, 2 conditions. I'm going to teach you, and then probe for maintenance of the same response over time. And the only difference between when they probed maintenance was, in one session for probe, the child had access to the items, and in another, they had no pre-session access, right? So these are things that they preferred, but the difference was access, level of deprivation. So if you look in baseline, no responding, they taught the mands, and then look at the difference when they probed for maintenance of the mand. The open squares denote no pre-session access. So you have high levels of responding of pre-session access and nearly no levels of responding if there is pre-session access. And it's really important because the thing is if you do not probe for maintenance of the mand under the right conditions or right levels of deprivation, you can get false negatives. And if you get false negatives, then your assumption is to proceed with treatment is to revisit those targets. And that, in essence, is sort of a waste of teaching time. Your learner has these responses. You just have to make sure to contrive the right conditions when probing them. Is that pretty clear? So think about those things too. I know most people are pretty good about doing preference assessments, but you also have to think levels of deprivation. Do you want one thing all the time, except for money? Money all the time. That's the ultimate generalized condition reinforcer. But does that make sense? Because I've certainly been to, I've certainly consulted on cases, and I'm sure you guys have come across this too, where I'll go, I don't know, he stopped working, I don't know what's going on, okay, he usually works really well for Oreos as an Oreo kid, okay. When was the last time you did a preference assessment? Oh, about 8 months ago. Things change. Hello.
Hi.
What's going on?
I'm plugging this in for you so you can point at the screen.
Yay.
I'm hoping it's going to work for you.
Because this thing, I don't think that's working very well, but uh-oh.
There, you got the pointer anyway.
Okay.
You might still have to advance here.
That's fine.
No, well, you have the pointer anyway.
Yeah.
Welcome. It's
Yeah, yes, good to see you too. Thanks. Okay. Are you guys with me so far? Does anyone have any questions? Okay, good. I like lots of, and if I see a furrowed brow, I'm like, what? Sometimes that's just people processing, if you will, and sometimes that's confusion. So if you're confused or I said something that doesn't quite make sense to you, just feel free. Do not be shy. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Okay? So this is pretty clear. Now I know sometimes some of these might feel really, really obvious, but they're not necessarily obvious, right? You have to still probe under the right conditions. So they were probing for maintenance of the same mands. Now they did a really great follow-up study, same basic group of folks, and they wanted to look at the influence of MOs on the generalization probes. So now what they wanted to know is, yeah, you can maintain it over time, but what does it look like if we're doing it across different people or across different locations? Now when you teach MANs, you need to be probing for generalization all over the place, right? You don't want just a learner who can ask for things with the item present in this chair, in this room, right, with this teacher. That's a no-no, right? You always got to think, when do I want you to be able to talk? All the time, hopefully, right? Yes, anywhere you go, you should be able to do this. So they had 3 young children diagnosed with autism. They also targeted response frames. May I have? Can I have? And they did just the same thing, access versus no access, pre-session access. Okay. These are pretty clear outcomes. So you have sessions across the x-axis, percentage of trials with a target mand along the y. These are outcomes for Ellen, and here where they're looking at generalization across locations, as you'd expect, there was no responding during baseline. Then they had some teaching trials. Open triangles denote sessions in which there was no access, and closed squares denote sessions in which there was prior access. And look at the difference in responding. That's a very dramatic difference. It's the same item. And these are things that I identified through a structured preference assessment, right? But if I don't set up the MOs the right way, and it was just brief pre-session access. We're talking about like 5 minutes. We're not talking about a couple hours. Think about how often we kind of go into session and we start using those preferred items to reinforce good sitting or nice playing, right? So think about that if you want to target some MANs. Right? Very clear differences across the classroom and the cafeteria. And again, here they wanted to see with a new familiar person and an unfamiliar person. Again, these denote no pre-session access. Closed squares denote pre-session access. And again, this is for Ellen. Same outcomes. Right? And what's really impressive to me, it's not that in the pre-session access there was less responding. There was virtually no responding. So that means that if I'm not contriving the MO properly, and I probe, and I get that, I'm thinking, this learner does not have this mand, right? It would be a reasonable conclusion. If you took out all the open data paths, you would say, this child does not have the mand. Okay? Oh, okay, yes. So I get this question. The what do you want? And the idea is to ask or not to ask. Should I ask this? It's not the question, but it's a very good question. There's one study that actually directly investigated the effects of this. One study, right? So that means that you all in your practice are in great positions to do some follow-up research. I always encourage actually practitioners to do research because practitioners, you are in the front line. You are seeing those clinical issues arise. You know it's relevant. So hopefully you're doing it. So this is the question, do we ask, what do you want? And I've actually heard people kind of heatedly debate this question, what do you want? We don't want to teach that. That shouldn't be under the control of the question, what do you want? Right now we have a partial intraverbal. So you shouldn't ask, what do you want? Right? They should be able to just tell you. The man should be solely under the influence of the MO. Okay. Fair enough. A man should be primarily under the influence of the MO. But shouldn't someone be able to also answer the question if someone asked, what do you want? Has anyone ever asked you, what do you want? Yes, it's a good thing that you know how to respond to that question. So let's look at the data and see what the data say. Yeah. So Bowen, Schillingsberg, and Carr conducted this study. And they wanted to compare the effects of man training with and without the question, what do you want? And they wanted to see how this affected acquisition and the maintenance of mans. Okay? They used, or they included, 2 children. The children, by the way, just so you know, could differentiate between what is it and what do you want. So that's important to note. Now, what they wanted to know, or what they looked at, is their primary dependent variable is cumulative correct independent mans, pre- and post-training probes, and cumulative correct independent and prompted mans, right? Okay, so they had 2 conditions, one in which they simply asked, what do you want? And one in which they omitted the what do you want. They looked the same. The only difference was in one condition they just said, what do you want? That's it. How many people have said that when training mans? Don't be afraid. No, you've all done it. I do it. I do, because it's a great prompt, too. Yeah, there's a lot of good. So I'll talk a little bit more about how to do that and how to fade that out when we get to recommendations for practice. So here are the outcomes. This is 2 participants, Aubrey and Chase. You can see in baseline that there is no responding as would be expected. Then they conducted training, and they wanted to see, this is question answering actually in the absence of the question, right? These are the post-training probes. But what these denote, for example, the open squares denote that these were taught in the condition in which the question was presented, and the closed data paths denote the condition in which these were taught without the question presented. And here's what's really interesting. It seems like they got a little bit of a greater rate of acquisition in the condition in which the question was presented, but they were still able to man in the absence of the question, right? So it's not bad. It's okay to ask, what do you want? Now, I want you to keep in mind, this is one study. The other thing to keep in mind about this study is that the items were present in this study. Might this be different if the items, let's say you use a rolling prompt delay to fade it out and see what it looks like in the absence? I don't know. That's a good question to ask. Maybe someone in here will ask that question. And this is another one I get. So we hear people heatedly debate discrete trial training versus managed training, which is kind of a strange distinction to me. But thankfully in this paper, they describe the differences between the two types of sort of ways they set up trials between these two styles. So here's what they did. In this study, they had 6 participants, all of them with a diagnosis of autism. And they just wanted to look at the frequency of requests. So they used 2 sets of stimuli. They labeled A and B. But the A and B stimuli went together. So if paper was an A crayon was in B. Or if bubbles was an A, then the bubble wand was in B. Does that make sense? That's how they taught them. Okay. So I want you to look at this. It's a nice little description. Okay. Here, between the 2 different conditions. Right? So this is discrete trial condition and the man training condition, and they describe the differences in terms of instructional materials, environmental arrangements, controlling variables, and prompt fading. Okay? But these are the ones I want you to take note of right here. 1, in the instructional materials. During the discrete trial training, they were selected by the instructor, and man training, they were selected by the child. Can you kind of guess what the outcomes are going to be looking at this? And this is another interesting one right here. In the DTI condition, they presented the discriminative stimulus, what do you want? But what's interesting is, in the man training, they said that the antecedent condition was the MO. Now here's the thing. You can teach what do you want and ensure the presence of the MO. Does that make sense? They're not mutually exclusive. Just because I'm going to teach something and present what do you want doesn't mean that means it must happen in the absence of the MO. But it seems that here they're making that distinction. So what do you really think the outcomes are going to be? Let's see what happens. These are really interesting outcomes, actually. Okay. So what they did is with 3 participants, they taught using man's training first. And then with the second participant, they taught using discrete trial training. Or excuse me, man training first, then discrete trial training. And the next 3, we'll see on the next graph, they started off with discrete trial training and went to man. And we want to control for sequence effects, right? You want to make sure there's not something about teaching one beforehand that facilitates acquisition of the other. All right, so if you can see with Maggie up here, we have independent mans occurring, the closed data path, and one's under prompt control with the open data path. And in man training, you can see that towards the end, we get a nice sharp increase on independent mans. Then they taught set A using discrete trial training. We have some, but we never really get a lot of independent responding. We still have a lot of prompt dependence. Do you see that? Okay. With Marcus, look here, we see nothing in baseline as expected. These are prompted responses. These are independent responses. Again, we see a nice big increase in independent responding. With man training and with discrete trial training, we see again some prompt dependence. No increase of independent responding over prompted responding here. And with Oliver, we never get independent responding with Oliver, unfortunately. Okay. But we do get prompted responses, which is a good start. Okay. Now, if they went the other way here, they started with discrete trial training, then moved to man training. These are independent responses. Open are the prompted responses. We can see we have a nice sharp increase of independent responses and a decrease of prompted responses here. And then we see in man training, we have an even greater increase of independent responding. With Christian, you see, again, during discrete trial training, some overlap. We don't really get independent responding occur over prompted responding, but we do get a nice sharp increase of independent responding here during the man training program. And again, we get some, Ryan here, Ryan would get independent responding across both. We always have those 1 or 2 participants who just like to do it a little differently. But the data don't lie. So the conclusions are, what would you conclude from this study? No? a shy audience. Okay. Well, one, I'm going to let the child select the items. I'm not going to select for the child. And two, what should be the primary variable, antecedent variable? The MO. Whether I present a what do you want or not, that MO has to be there. Good. Yeah.
When it said the discriminatory stimulus was what do you want, that also assumes that the MO wasn't necessarily there.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And they were also selecting for the child.
Right.
Yeah. So they were all, but what's interesting is they used all items that are preferred. That's a good question. But what they did is, even in the discrete trial condition, they still use items that they identified through a preference assessment, which is the cool part. But they had those items. So the idea is, well, the kid likes all those items, but it's the teacher that selected, now we're going to work on this one. In the man condition, it was reach. The child would reach, okay, great, and we're going to go from there. Do you see the difference? And that really is an MO issue, right? Because remember, look, there's probably lots of things that you like. But depending on what I'm going to ask you to do and how you feel that day and what you've experienced beforehand, your preferences are going to change. So if I sort of select from one of your banks of likes for you, you might be like, But if I let you pick, so what I want you to, and that's a great question, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because what I'm hoping that you guys are seeing is that motivation is not a static thing. It's not, I do a preference assessment, 6 months to a year from now, this should work. This is still number 1, number 2, number 3. Not quite like that, is it? It's sort of layers of motivation. MO is sort of ebb and flow. You know what? I might not care after 2 cookies about the cookies anymore. I might like them at first. I don't want them now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it just seems, with so many prompts, it seems to me that either the item, obviously the MO isn't there, and that they just don't want the item.
That's it. They didn't. This is exactly right. Yeah. But it's not, and that's a great conclusion. And the idea is, again, they use items identified through a structured preference assessment. So there was nothing like, here's a bowl of dirt, and here's a lollipop, and it was, these are things we identified that you like, but I'm going to decide for you that we're going to work for this now. And also children are like, no. Some measure of control, and that's what's so beautiful about really starting with MANS, is I'm giving my learners some measure of control over the environment. I mean, that's precisely what's so nice about verbal behavior. Right? That's a great question. Oh, yes. So, in this study, Albert and her colleagues, I like this, they use what's called an interrupted behavior chain procedure to find another way to contrive the MO. And I like this because you really should, really have a number of ways of contriving the MO. It's just good for practice, and it's good for your learner. Another reason why I like using the behavior chain procedure is it can help your learner expand on what functions as a reinforcing item. We know sometimes working with individuals with autism, the range of reinforcers can sometimes be quite narrow. It could be a bit slim. So here's another way to kind of add to that bank of reinforcers. So they had 3 children with autism. All these children vocally managed for a wide variety of reinforcers, most of the time when the item was present. So that's where the participants were in terms of functioning level. They wanted to look at prompted and unprompted MANs, or no responding. And so this is what they did. They took 3 previously established preferred activities. And they determined that by the children consistently manding for the activities. Then each activity involved multiple steps that led to the terminal reinforcer, and they taught the children to complete each response chain using a total task analysis. Okay? And then what they did is they simply just removed an item necessary to complete the chain in order to contrive the MO. Okay? But what's really neat, one of the things that they wanted to see, will you man for the item? Is this a good way to contrive the motivating operation? But one of the things that they also did is after they taught them the man, they wanted to probe for tacts. So if you know how to ask for this, do you know how to label these things too now? And so this is a good idea to look for emergence of other verbal behavior. And I'll talk about another study next that seems to suggest teaching mans is a really good way to start because it may produce emergence of other verbal behavior better than starting with a different verbal operant. Yeah. Are you going to go tell them? Hush. They're very enthusiastic. It's fine. Thanks. Which I thought was really cool. So, is it going to go? Okay. So these are just multiple baseline design across participants. We have Victor's outcomes. So this is no response, prompted, and man's fully under the influence of the MO, which is what you want, right? That's the one where the child's searching for the item and just asks, right? Doesn't ask when, prompted with what do you want, okay? As you can see in baseline, we have a little bit of MO responding here for toaster. I wonder what they were doing with toaster. Okay, so they had virtually no responding, and then you see during man training, we get nice, consistent manding under the influence of the MO. So indeed, interrupted behavior chain procedures. Has anyone used this before? Is a fun way, I got to tell you. So we're going to get to man for information training, which is really the part that I get excited about. And you have to use chains. Chains are the way to go. You don't have to, but it's a fun way to go because you can use them in a lot of clever ways. It also gets your participants super excited. If you ever use, has anyone ever made a volcano? That is the chain. I've yet to meet any child who does not like that chain. That is a chain to end all chains. All right. Wow, it's just bumping out there. Man, I'm going to try and get more rock and roll in here. I'm sorry, guys. All right, so they replicated the effects with Nathaniel. When they use the interrupted behavior chain, we get some nice, consistent responding under the influence of the MO. And the same with Karina, some nice, consistent responding under the MO. So it's an effective way. So I'm going to talk about how to use chains later today when we get to the recommendations part. And I don't have the data for this, but they got consistent tacting of the items as well. So again, tacting is labeling. Because here's the thing. Treatment, as we all very well know, is very resource intensive and can be quite cumbersome for families financially. It's just, we have a lot of people with needs, a few practitioners. It's a real demand on resources. So the idea is we're doing, a lot of colleagues and I are actually doing research on emergent responding, one of which is Dr. Peter's daughter, who's presenting right now on emergent responding and intraverbals. Any way that you can get more bang for your buck is a good thing to do for your practice. All right, so this is an interesting outcome that they got some tacting as well. And Dr. Peter's daughter did this study with Jim Carr and Jack Michael. And this is what they wanted to know. They had 5. These were typically developing. These are neurotypical children in this study. And they gave them a puzzle assembly task. And it was kind of a complex puzzle that had like made up names. And what they did is they first taught them how to man some or tact some of the pieces of the puzzle and see, just by doing that, could they man for them without having to directly teach them to do so. And then for some items, they taught them how to man for those items, and afterwards they just probed, could they tact them without directly training them to do so. So as you can see here, this is for one of our participants. There's no responding during baseline. And then they conducted man training. And of course, you would expect elevated levels of mans after man training. But look at the level of tacts after man's training. These are freebies. This is emergence. This is nice. Here they conducted tact training. And as expected, we would get tacts. But we got some mans, but not as much or as consistent as we did with tacts after man's training. The take-home point here, start with mans. they're motivated. They repeat and they're motivated, right? All righty. Okay. Now, once you have some vocal manding, okay. Once you have some vocal manding, well, let's start with getting some vocal manding. Now, I'm sure you've been in the position before. Parents, what they want, number one, they want the vocal mands, yeah. And this is probably also one of my most favorite studies that I'm presenting today. And I'm going to go back and we're going to use this in the clinic because I think it's an extraordinarily cool tool to use. Okay. So this is what they did. Here's the idea of what sort of inspired the study. And you know this through your practice. You know when you have a learner with a deficit in MANS, that it could be for a variety of reasons, right? It could be because they're prompt dependent. It could be because they just can't say the words very well, right? And what they did to this assessment, they said, wouldn't there be a cool way if I could just run them through an assessment so I could actually pinpoint precisely where the deficit is so that when we go to actually produce a treatment package, it's one that addresses my individual learner's specific needs. So that's what they did. And I think this is magnificent. I was very impressed with this. So let's take a look. I'm going to run you through the, and so that's, again, these are all citations. And this is just so you guys can go look these up if you want to go take a, and I urge you to contact the literature as much as possible. But it's by Beret, Vollmer, and Rapp. Dr. Vollmer's are also here, I believe, right now, giving a presentation. So this is what they did. They'd start off the trial with some identified preferred item. And then what they did is, oh, I'm trying to use the arrows so desperately, all right. Now, if they produced an utterance, so if the learner said tunes, there you go, great, here's your radio. And the child could play with the radio to the end. Now, 10 seconds go by, they gave what's called a non-specific prompt, and that was, if you want this, ask me for it. Now, the child emitted a full utterance tunes, and they would deliver the radio. If that didn't happen, then they'd give a model prompt, and it went, if you want this, say tunes. Okay. So the child did. They would get the radio. If not, then they give a phoneme prompt. Nick, say t. Okay. And then they start it all over. Now, here are the outcomes. I just think it's so clever because it's not cumbersome. You can go to your practice and do this. It's easy. I just need a timer and my kid. An identified preferred item. Nice and I just like things that translate easy to practice, you know? And I think it's a very smart way to do this. And so they collected these data. These are the outcomes of the assessment. Now look at here for Will. Let's just look at Will. This is Mike and Nick. We're going to look in the top two. Now we look at the top. And we see that we're getting partial utterances. So he's saying something like two. Under the non-specific prompt, the one of you want this, say tunes. And then we see responding drop off. And then we see an increase in independent responding. Right here. He just starts saying it. Right? So partial utterances at various levels of prompting and then nothing from sessions 8 to 11. And then second panel, we see full utterances occur at various levels of prompting and then occur independently for the final sessions. So I've got this kid now at the end going, tunes, tunes. So he's learning. He's learning the mand right there, right? This indicates that he can learn to independently mand with the prompt and reinforcement strategies used in the assessment. And that for him, vocal mand training should just consist of reinforcement as a partial prompt. Sometimes it's just getting them to contact that reinforcement contingency. Does that make sense? He just didn't know what was going on. And as soon as he went, tune, here. And then it's, oh, okay, I got you, right? Sometimes it's just a matter of contacting the reinforcement contingency. Now, we look here at Mike in the third panel. We got partial utterances for Mike with a phoneme prompt, right? This suggests for Mike, what would you do with Mike? What would you do with Mike? We've got a guy who's like, I say t, and he says t. Where would you go with him? What does that kid need? It's different from Will. Will's like tunes. He's he's still prompt dependent. And he's going, so okay, so I'm going to say, well, Will, you might just need to contact the reinforcement contingency. Mike, we need to shape up vocal responding. We need to help you get there, right? Now with Nick, this is interesting. Nick is saying, giving full utterances, but they're prompt-dependent utterances, right? So he's reliably producing the full utterance after non-specific prompts. And you want to say tunes, right? And he's saying it, but only after I keep saying that, right? And so what this means is that for Nick, I got a prompt-dependent kid on my hands. He can say it, but only after I give him that prompt. So that means for him, I'm going to focus on prompt fading. So do you see how this assessment, nice and simple, helped pinpoint 3 very distinct deficits or areas, challenging areas, and now I can build a treatment plan that's not just hodgepodge. I'm not just throwing things kind of randomly at the kid. I'm going to go, you just contact the reinforcement contingency. You, we've got to shape some stuff up. You, we've got to fade those prompts as fast as we can, which I think is just fantastic. So this is what they did. They said, well, let's see if our assessment works. So let's develop a treatment plan based on these outcomes. So here we go with Will. So they did some prompted responses. He contact contingency, and boom, we get unprompted requests for music. He contacted the prompts, so ergo the reinforcement contingency for asking for video, and boom, towards the end you see that all that independent responding. So it was effective. Those assessment outcomes really did accurately and effectively inform treatment. So now let's look at, okay, now we're looking at, I think we're looking at Mike here. Okay, now remember Mike, he's the one that we have to do some shaping, right? So he's under phoneme prompts, he's giving partial utterances. So we're doing just sort of, we're doing non-specific prompts, just in case, show again. Nothing, no responding. So we just start off with shaping t, just give me the t. And as you can see, they shape up the response towards the end. Then they move to 2, less responding here. Tune, boom, tunes. And at the end, we've got no tune, but tunes. He's saying the response, right? Now, unfortunately, at least within the context of the study, he remained prompt dependent. It's okay. What this demonstrates, however, is that those assessment outcomes really did provide a good guide with respect to what to focus on with this learner. It's easy, well, there is a way to fade prompts. Easy, sometimes not so much. And then here we go, we have Nick. Now remember, Nick is the one who's saying it, but he's totally prompt dependent. So what they did is we have prompt dependent, the phoneme prompt dependent responding here, and then they faded the prompt. So it was Nick say tunes to Nick to Nick, and then now completely independent responding right here. They did the same thing with him. With Plato, we got completely independent responding. So do you see how this assessment is a nice, easy to implement assessment, and it very accurately informed a good treatment plan? So who has time to waste? I know I don't, and I'm sure I know you don't, right? So I thought this was a very, very clever way to assess some vocal manding. So you've got your learners who are vocally manding. Now once you get there, this is what we want. We want to increase variability in responding, don't we? Because, you know, how many folks are in here practice behavior analysis or behavior analysts or identify? Oh, just like a little handful. Okay, so one of the sometimes critiques is that of behavior analysis when we do language training is we tend to produce learners with really rigid language. And I'll say it, some people do, right? And that has to do with, and that has a lot to do with like how you set up conditions and vary those conditions, antecedent and consequence conditions, right? It doesn't have to be that way, right? So this is really one cool study that looked at how you can actually, now when we have some vocal manding, increase variability in responding. Okay. Okay, here we go. I'm jumping the gun here. I'm getting excited. All right. All right. So Hernandez and her colleagues, they wanted to determine man forms for 3 preschool-age children that already seemed to be at risk for language delays. And they wanted to look at the effects of providing differential reinforcement for larger and smaller topographical man classes, and then evaluate the extent to which training both single and framed man, so single man would be like truck, and a frame would be I want truck, okay, would result in the emergence of new mans, okay, because you want as much new responding, accurate and appropriate responding as possible. So they had 2 boys, both with nonspecific developmental delays, and 1 typically developing girl. All of the participants could emit a few vocal mans with their primary communication consisted primarily, a little redundant there, mostly of gesturing, crying, and taking items from others. Yes? Yes. All right. So what they wanted to look at, their dependent variable was the frequency of undesirable behavior. So that would be the pointing and the crying and the shaking, to single words, truck, to man frames. I want truck, please. Okay. And what they used was differentially reinforcing all responding. That includes the inappropriate responses, single word frames, and or single mans and man frames, and then differential reinforcement of single word and framed responses. And then they differentially reinforce only frames. These are kids who are like primarily crying. So we tend to think sometimes, I got a kid with just so few words, I can't jump in with a frame. Well, the data are very interesting on this one. So let's do a look at the MAND assessment first. Okay, this is for Jason. We have sessions on the x-axis and responses per minute on the y. And this is across a variety of items. You can see music, puppet, bears, dinosaurs, and puzzles. The closed data paths denotes undesirable responding. It's the pointing or the weeping. Single words are denoted by the open square data path, and then framed mans are those denoted by the closed triangles. Now, in non-contingent reinforcement, where they have access to everything, as you can expect, we're not going to get much manding because they've got this stuff right there. Now, this is where they differentially reinforce all of it, the inappropriate, the single, or man frames. Anything goes here. And what you see for Jason, for his outcomes, is that he has some pretty good responding with single words, a little bit of undesirable behavior. Then they go back to NCR for some nice experimental control. Virtually no responding, really, maybe some undesirable behavior. And then back to DRA, and we get, he's a single word responder, it looks like, right? Mixed in with some inappropriate responding. So now I have an idea, okay, this is what he does. So this is a nice assessment you can use. Like, where is my learner? Am I getting primarily like inappropriate responding? Am I primarily going to get some single word responding, or can I get some frames from this learner? Okay. So we look at Jason again. So as you can expect, let's just look at the top panel. This is independent responses per minute on the Y and sessions on the X. Let's just look at the top. Here we have, as we expect, in NCR, no responding. Now, this is differential reinforcement of single word responding. And we have some nice single word mans, right? We go back to, now we have differential reinforcement of frames, and look what happens. We get an increase in these responses. We go back to NCR, no responding, DRA, we get an increase in single word, and then differential reinforcement of frames. And these were pretty consistent across all participants, and that we were getting more responding and novel responding when we implemented and differentially reinforced frames. And these were participants that have few single words to begin with, right? Because the implication of this study is that, and I used to think so myself, that you need to get, a good 100, 200, 300 single word mans before we even dare go to frames, right? I don't know if you've heard this, or it's something that it almost kind of feels like it makes sense to do it that way. But the implication is, actually, no, you don't. You actually can get better and more varied responding and longer utterances if we start introducing frames just after a few, maybe 2 to 3 mans are established. This one kind of surprised me a little bit, to be honest. All right. Now, once you have frames, how do you increase response variability with those frames? All right. So this is what they did in this study. So now we have kids who are using the frame, but we got the I want cookie, I want juice, I want truck, right? So now you want a little bit something else. May I please have, can I have? You get some more fluidity of responding when you increase the number of frames. And so what they wanted to look at is two things. They wanted to look at extinction as a way of increasing variability. Do you all know what extinction is? So if I no longer reinforce a response, then what happens is you get this thing called extinction-induced operant variability. So if you're always asking for something, and one day, like gummy bears, and one day I just don't reinforce anymore, what you'll see is you'll start to get actually sometimes emotional responding. But sometimes you can get some variation in responding. It's a nice way to kind of capture new behavior. It's how we shape responding, actually. Is we reinforce a certain response for a while at one level and then stop, and then they start engaging in some other types of responses. So they want to see, okay, if we just reinforce the man frames and then stop altogether, might we get new man frames? Or if I just teach you new man frames, is that enough to increase variability? Will you kind of take them? Or do I need to do these things together? Do I need to teach you new man frames and then place them under extinction, right? They wanted to do those three analyses, and they used a voice recorder and scripts. So it was simply that the child would press the button, and it would give them a new man frame. Okay. And this is what I want you to see in this one. Now, this is a lot of action going on here, and the data points are really, really, really tiny. So this is what I want you to focus on. I want you to focus on this middle panel right here. We have sessions here, and I think we have a number of novel man frames here. Now, this is all I want you to focus on, just this middle panel. I just want you to see that in baseline, does extinction alone work? Nothing. The kid was like, what? All right, fine. No novel responding. Now, they taught a new frame, but it wasn't until we placed it under extinction that we started to increase variability. Then they taught a second frame, right here, and then we went to extinction and got variability responding. Then they taught a third frame and placed that under extinction. Oops, I did have that. Let's see. We got a lot more variability in responding here. And to boot, generalization. So once you have some frames, you're going to want to introduce new frames, and you may want to do that and use extinction at the same time, and then start differentially reinforcing novelty of responding to get some variability. Okay. All right. So we're going to go to some recommendations for teaching manding, and then we'll be done here, and we'll get a break, and then we'll come back and finish up with mands for information. Okay? There's some broad recommendations for teaching manding, just based on the things that we saw or we just covered, okay? Man training needs to be your primary emphasis of the EIBI program. It wasn't when I was taught initially, years ago. I don't even know if we did man training when I first started there. It was tax training. It was very strange, because he could tax things like a compass, but he couldn't ask for a break or help, right? Poor kid. I just remember him crying. It was just so frustrating, right? You want your learner to be able to get needs met. Right? Communication is key. This is one I get from parents. Which response modality? Now, they all want the talking, right off the bat. Naturally, of course, right? And that's desirable because most people know how to respond to that, right? So there are things like, they say, look, do we use a picture exchange card? Do we use, assistive technology? Do I teach sign? Do I teach vocal verbal behavior? This is my answer. Your child exists in multiple verbal communities. That means at home, and that means at school, maybe some daycare somewhere. And so my question is, what are going to be responses that are reinforced? Am I going to teach sign language to a child for whose responses are not going to be reinforced at home or at school? No. I want them to meet success for engaging in their response, right? So first give consideration. Which kinds of responses are going to be reinforced in your learners' communities, verbals communities? And then the next question is, and it's a very fair question, is, what can my child do right now? Now, just because my child cannot do something right now doesn't mean they will not be able to. So I got a lot of parents when I say the word PECS who get very panicky. And they say, no, PECS is going to get in the way of them acquiring vocal verbal behavior. That is not true. And in fact, there's research that suggests that it can help and facilitate vocal verbal behavior. When implemented properly, that should always be kind of a given, right? So it's not ever nothing is going to get in the way. Nothing should get in the way. But for example, if I don't have a child who's vocalizing, who has a really hard time with, imitating, I'm not going to just wait. I want that child to be able to start communicating right away. So I might start with sign, or I might start with an iPad, or I might start with a picture exchange, and simultaneously work on some vocal verbal responding. I might implement in the COAT program right away as we're working on PECS, and we're always talking during PECS. And during PECS, if I get a word instead of a card, oh, you bet I'm going to throw a huge party, because that word's going to win. Sign language, again. Do I have a child who has good enough fine motor skills? Maybe not. So maybe that's not a good way to go with my learner. Make sense? So you want to ask yourself, what can my child do right now? And what responses are going to be reinforced in my learners' communities? Okay, antecedents. This is what means what you think about what happens before the response occurs. How do you set up conditions? You know that I'm going to say that the MO, it's got to be there. It's got to be there. That should be the primary controlling variable. The primary controlling variable. Okay. So you can contrive the MO by identifying preferred items or activities, using things like a structured preference assessments, interviewing teachers and caregivers, or direct observation. My recommendation is when you can, do structured preference assessments. Also, if you do a fresh preference assessment, you'll usually get a hierarchy, most preferred, second preferred, third. For the few days after that, do a quick one array. There is research to support the efficacy of a one array, so I might just put the 3 in front of my learner and say, just have them pick, and whatever gets picked first, great, we're going to go with that today. And whatever they reach for is what I'm going to go for also. And I let them take control. And sometimes we have learners we can simply ask, what do you want to work for? And they can tell you that's even better. But there's many ways to obtain this information. Right? Make sure they're sufficiently deprived. Most people get the preference assessment part right, but they don't think about deprivation. If he just ate a bag of Oreos, although this learner, I got to tell you, he persisted. He really liked Oreos. He was 2.5. And he really liked them for a long time. He's 13.5 now. It's really neat. And he comes up to me and he said, he taught me how to talk. And that is a really nice feeling. I'm sure many of you know. I said, I did. That was fun. He really loved Oreos. Sometimes what you can do is entice a little bit with some brief access. You want Oreo? Yeah. A little bit of Oreo, yeah. Then he's like, yeah. It's like, all right. What do you want? Just a little bit. Don't be mean. But sometimes to kind of get the ball rolling, play with the bubbles a little bit, then wait it out. Okay, so there's a divide. I also hear people saying, like, do you do verbal behavior or ABA? Have you heard this before? Or DTT? Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I think it's kind of a weird and confusing distinction. When people ask me that, I just say, I'm a behavior analyst. I just practice behavior analysis. I just use behavior analytic principles to teach. Sometimes I like some structured events at the table. Sometimes we do things away from the table. You should be everywhere, especially with man training. It needs to happen all the time. So you know what? Don't be afraid to sit at the table. It's okay to have some structured time. And that can also help organize your learner. You can kick out some trials. If you're going to work at the table, though, just make sure that we're not just saying, what do you want, right? So make sure it's still kid-led. So I might throw some stuff out there that you like and whatever you reach for. Okay. And you all know, I mean, if you get some really good tangibles, sometimes those can go a long way. if they're sufficiently deprived. But you also want to, and I impress this upon my parents, and we'll even go out to my parents' homes to show them how to do this. And think about this as you're doing parent training. So one of the things that I learned, because I learn a lot through directing a clinic. I love working with my families. They teach me a lot. And one of the things I learned is I'm teaching parents in a very structured environment and then assuming that they can just go home and do certain things. It's like, what? And I felt like, Sarah, you should know a little bit better than that. So sometimes if you need to go to the homes and teach them just how to use the day. So that means if they go and they pop on the TV or learn, you pop it right off. And there it is. I'm capturing the motivating operation. What do you want? Right? Throughout the day, give them dinner without a fork. Right? All right. Structured or unstructured, all you have to make sure is that the relevant MO is in place. That's the key. That's the most important part. So again, asking what do you want? Is it okay? It doesn't, so far, the research suggests that it doesn't seem to hinder acquisition or maintenance of demand. But this is what I would say to you. Monitor the rate of acquisition. And you also want to ensure that your learner will mand in the absence of the question. I don't want a learner who's dependent on that question. I want to fade that question out. So make sure that you probe in the absence of that question and use it. Nice, you can use a rolling prompt delay. I'm sure some of you have used like fading techniques. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? It's really nice, very effective. Sometimes parents ask me, should we teach with the activity or item present? Initially, sure, that's fine. It's a good way to start. But again, fade that item away. Because what you want is the EO or the MO and not the site or the activity to be what influences their response. Right? That's why it's okay if it's there, but just make sure that they can when it's not there too. Does that make sense? So it kind of looks like this when you first teach, right? You have your antecedent behavior consequence. You might have MO present. If I'm going to make, let's say, target cookie, right? Okay, kid wants cookies, hungry, he hasn't had cookies in a while, okay? I have the cookie present. I might ask, what do you want? I may say something like, I want cookie, a little echoic. The behavior, kid says, I want cookie. I deliver the cookie, and then I might deliver some praise. I also get a lot of questions about this. Do I also give praise? And I got to tell you, and I want to do a study on this, to be honest, because as far as I know, there's no study about comparing, does it hinder acquisition if I give praise in addition to the item? My thing is, your priority needs to be the delivery of the item mandate for. I mean, that defines the man. It specifies the reinforcer, right? So I need to give the reinforcer for it to functionally become a man. Clinically, I know that we're all are for yay, or just get excited that your learner did it. That's really nice asking. Good job. Is it a problem if you do it? No. But after a while, let's say fade that out because they're just asking for stuff. Right? Give them the thing that they're asking for. So eventually what you want is you want this to fade away. You need to systematically think about how you're going to remove these things. Because in the end, this should be the contingency that maintains bands. An MO, they give the response, they get the thing they ask for. Okay? So you hear people say capture or contrive the MO. Capturing the MO is just observing your learner's responses and kind of going for it right there. Right? So I might see my learner trying to reach for something that's out of reach. Great, that's an opportunity. Right? Taking advantage of the things that are occurring naturally in the environment, or contrive the MO. You can do this through structured preference assessments, interrupted behavior chain procedures that produce a desirable outcome. You can remove an item. I can sort of manipulate things. You turn on the TV, I turn it off. You want something that's within reach, I put it out of reach. Right? If you want ideas about how to contrive the MO, I can also give you my I'll just give my email address at the end because we have tons of sheets and worksheets for parents for different ideas for doing that. There are many, so people say, how do I prompt? Okay, a ton of prompting techniques and prompt fading techniques have been supported as effective in the research literature. So this is what I say. whatever prompt system you select, one, it's usually going to be one based on that specific learner's individual history. So usually with some kids, you'll see that they're pretty good with certain kinds of prompts, verbal prompts, gestural prompts. You can use textual prompts and certain prompt fading systems. Use that. If there's a history, and this is empirically supported advice, if there's a history, with success with certain prompts, use that prompt. That's going to be the best one for you. Just whatever prompt and prompt fading system you use, be consistent and systematic about it. That is not as easy as it seems because you actually have to keep track of stuff, right? Be consistent and systematic. Okay. Reinforce. Seems obvious. Reinforce the man with the item itself, and I mean right away. So if you're asking for a chip, and the child said, not you, you probably manned quite well. If your learner says chip, you don't, hey, nice job, airplane, oh, tickle the belly, and then 2 minutes later give a chip. No, no. If it's chip, I'm just almost going to, almost just throw it in your face. Just, yes, good job, right? Always. Your learner says cookie, deliver cookie, happy learner. You always want a cute kid picture in there, right? All right. So when it comes to vocal mans, I recommend using that preliminary assessment that we talked about to identify specifically where your learner might have some troubles, because that should then inform your treatment. Are you going to look at your prompt and prompt fading system, or are you going to use shaping? How do you want to do this? The recommendations based, teach 1 to 3 single word mans, then introduce frames and differentially reinforce those frames. Let's see what happens. Now, here's a recommendation. Once you start introducing frames, if your learner is emitting new single word mans, don't not reinforce those initially. Reinforce those. That's okay. And for increasing variability with man frames, if you have a learner that's there, I recommend using this extinction. You don't even have to use an auditory like script if you've got a visual, someone who can read, or you can also just provide the prompt. Have everybody use a recorder, one of those Big Macs, they can just press the button themselves? It's a big button, and you can just record whatever you want on it. And you can use a script there so the child learns how to prompt him or herself. Click, I would like some. It's pretty handy to have. All right, so now we're going to get to some man videos. So I just want to show you just a couple examples.
Here, can I interrupt you for a
Yes.
second? They do clear the food away soon, and I did check it.
There's
It's still
food.
out there.
They get food at break time?
Yeah, would it be possible to break quickly
Yeah.
the videos?
Yeah. I'm at 10:30. Okay, so let's meet at like, 10:45, so that'd give me till 12. This does go by faster. Okay, all right. Yes, I want you to eat. Yes, these poor food deprived folks. Yeah, so we should just do the break now, and then we'll come back and finish up with videos. So it's 10 minutes or 15?
Are you guys okay with 10? Would you be okay with 10?
Is that reasonable? Okay, so that would be at 10. Let's do 10:40. So that's 12 minutes. There's a little compromise there. Am I going too slow?
I should have said earlier that the food closed
I
at
didn't
10:30.
even know that there was like a food.
Helen, what do you
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some videos for just man's training, and then after that we're going to move into a bit of a lit review and some recommendations for practice for man's for information. This is my area that I love so much, so hopefully I won't stay on track. Just keep me on track. Again, if you have questions, just throw the hand up. I need to keep it moving along, so afterwards we can chat a little bit about it, any questions that you might have as well. So what I want to show you in the first this first little segment here is one of my therapists, and she's presenting all the everything at once. So she's got the MO, right? So he's got paper, but he doesn't have his crayon. She's going to ask, what do you want? She's going to show the item, and she's going to give him the echoic. So it's okay to start here. It's very fast, so.
What do you want?
Now, let's see.
Helen, what do you want? Say crayon. Crayon, good job.
See, she did praise him and tickle him a little bit. It's hard to not do that. Do you see it? I need to put, oh, did you just see Mans 1 through 7? Okay. Well, that's not. Oh, my microphone's here. Thank you. Is that what you were doing? Is that what you were gesturing?
Yeah.
I saw you in the back and I saw this. I was like, I don't know what's happening back there. Do you really like my talk? How much do you like my talk? Okay. You want to hear me. I talk so loudly. Do I have new people? Are you new? Do I have new people? Ooh, I caught you sneaking in. You can catch the show again this afternoon. Okay. This thing is huge. All right. So now I have to put down the power. So you just heard this happen. Okay. Let's do that. Let's try again. We ready?
Helen, what do you want? Say crayon. Crayon,
And he did,
good
didn't he?
job.
Can you see it? Why? Why now? Why can they not see the videos? Because do I need to? I did. Like actually X out of it? I minimized. I did minimize. Let's try this again.
Helen, what do you want? Say crayon. Crayon, good job.
Imagine a really cute little boy.
It's really cute.
Please, please. I have so many videos of cute children, and I have like amazing like prompt fading, and no, I will reenact this if I have to. I'm going to keep trying. I'm not techno-facile at all, so I'm going to just scroll through. I did minimize. I did minimize the PowerPoint. This is why I'm confused. Do you see it? Do you
Helen,
see it,
what
child?
do you want? Say crayon. Crayon, good job.
Let's see what else I can do. Let's see if this works. So I have to close PowerPoint. Okay, that's fine.
Helen, what do you want? Say crayon. Crayon, good job.
You see it now? Could you see it? Okay. So you saw it. So she had it. What do you want? Gave him the response. So all prompts are there. So again, it's okay to start there, but you want to start to fade it. So the next segment you'll see, it's another therapist with him, and she's going to have the crayon present. She's going to say, what do you want? But then she's going to hold off just a little bit. She ends up having to give him the echoic, tell him what to say, but she's trying to hold off just a little bit. All right, let's see. He wanted to count so badly.
What do you want?
See, hold off.
Say crayon.
Then gives it to him.
That's right, buddy. That is crayon. Good asking for your crayon. Good job.
Okay, so now in this video, and the next one you see prompt, this is a different child, them introducing just the item and the what do you want and no echoic. So I just want you to see what each step looks like as they fade out prompts.
Okay. What do you want? You want fruit roll?
Well, but so it's called a tact prompt as well. So she's looking at the item. So she didn't need to tell her fruit roll-up, but she saw it. She had it there in front of her. These are all okay as long as, again, you start to systematically fade these prompts. And the last one, she's just getting the what do you want?
Marissa, sit good. Good sitting.
Little
What do you
coat.
want? A chip. Great
She said a
job saying
chip.
chip, Marissa.
Okay.
Awesome job.
So no
There you
items
go.
present. The only thing she got is what do you want? And so eventually he's going to want to fade that out. And the next series of videos I want to show you, this is one of my most favorite guys. I just love this kid. I love them all, but he worked so hard. But he was pretty prompt dependent. And so they had to ask him, what do you want? And then give him the full man frame. I want water. And so they wanted to fade that out. Fade the I want and the what do you want. They had the item present. So you'll see here, they're going to give him the prompt. He's going to emit the response, and then they're going to start fading out. They're going to hold out, and they're going to fade out the I want part. And this one is...
One soda? All right.
So now we can go ahead and prompt the I want soda.
I want soda?
I want soda.
Okay. What do you want?
Eat what? Soda.
There you go.
So I
Good
got it.
job.
So they're going to do it again. Yeah.
All right.
What do you want?
Eat what? Soda.
All right.
Yeah.
Good boy. All right.
Yeah. So it's good. Now in this next video, she's going to start fading out that more. You'll see her fading out the I want just wee bit more. I like this. So she's got the water. They're working with water. She's holding it. She's just waiting it out. She doesn't want to ask him anything. She's taking out the what do you want part.
One.
She just opened her mouth. And then I want water. Now in this last one, you'll see she's going to do that once. She's going to hold the item. She's going to just a slight. She's faded out. Just open the mouth. And then one more trial after that. Let's see if he gets it independently. He gets enamored with himself in the mirror in one of the videos for a few minutes. So we'll just skip through that. Can you see that clearly? Okay. Can you watch Taylor?
One.
I want water.
Okay. See, this kid was super prompt dependent. So now we just got the
Good, Brandon.
One.
Nice.
did.
Yeah. Dude,
Woo. Right, with nothing but the item present. So he's one of those. He has a full utterance, but there's it's an incredible prompt dependence there. Okay, let me find my PowerPoint now. Oh. Yep. Especially for the master information one. This is where people usually really need the visuals. Did I do from? No, of course I did not. Yay. All right, so begins our conversation. Yes?
What's your long-term goal for
My long-term goal, so what I would ultimately want, and that's a great question, because you always need to think when you're teaching is, what do I want my learner to ultimately do? And I want my learner to ultimately do what I do, which is when I need or want something, without any prompting, I can approach the right person and ask for that thing in the absence of the item, in the absence of someone asking me what I want. So ultimately, I would want a learner like him to, when he needs water, if he doesn't go get it himself, to be able to go up to someone and say, I want water. Without any other prompt, without someone holding the water, without asking him what he wants. Right? So ultimately, I only want the motivation, the need for water, the want for water, to influence the response. Does that make sense?
So then, you faded out one section. When do you begin to fade out her holding water there?
Right afterwards?
So then you'll eventually just go to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a learner-dependent thing. So, with him, I might want to stick to holding the water there for a while and seeing if I would get some pretty robust responding, some consistent responding for I want water or with the water there. Then I might just pour the glass and have the glass. Then I might just hold the glass to my side and then eventually just put it right behind me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's why you got to think about your prompt and your prompt fading systems very carefully. And whatever you elect to do, be consistent. Be consistent and systematic about it. It's very good questions. All right. So let's move on to Man's for Information. I'm going to try to not completely blaze through this. To try out? Well, it worked. I just have to completely close out the PowerPoint to make it work. Okay, sure. If we can do this quickly enough. So if I minimize it,
Yeah, it's minimized.
okay.
It said escape.
See, I minimized before and it didn't work. That's why I had to
Okay.
close it. And so then I can go right to my folder and I can go to my videos. Now it didn't work with these videos. I have no idea why it would be different here. They can see it. Now you can see it. You just need to stay right here. Okay. All right. I promise I minimized.
And then it's
All right, we're good. Let's do this thing. Okay, the time's making me a bit nervous. I'm a fast talker. So if if it's too much, just be like, slow down. Okay? All right. This is the part that I'm really excited about. All right. So let me define man's for information. It's a verbal operant influenced by the MO and specifies its reinforcer. This sounds familiar because it should be. Why? Because it's a man. So sometimes people ask me, like, why do you make the distinction between the two? And the truth is it's very procedural. It's to kind of help people think about how to set it up the right way. Because there's extra considerations you need to think about when contriving the man or the MO in teaching man's for information, okay? It is a man. In this case, though, information is specified as a reinforcer, right? These are just some examples: who, what, when, where, why, how. And as a learner progresses through his or her program, it becomes important to target man's for information and a little earlier on than you think. What is going on out there? I mean, wow. I just feel like it should be way more fun in here. Right. Here are the things. Here's some benefits to man's for information. Now, if you think about it, man's for information are ubiquitous. Most of the mans that you emit on a daily basis are man's for information, right? The things that are helpful about mans are beneficial. They expand other aspects of a verbal repertoire. So you hear little kids all the time, what's that? And you teach them how to label things that way so it can lead to expansion of the tact repertoire. It can help you navigate your environment more efficiently, right? So instead of rummaging through a bunch of drawers, you might ask somebody where are the car keys and find what you need right away. It's critical for educational success. Think about going through school without being able to demand for information. You cannot. You're always demanding for information. It's important for social success, too. How many demands for information do you emit in a conversation with a friend? How was your weekend? How are you doing? How is your family doing? Here's what's interesting, though. In teaching demands for information to individuals on the autism spectrum can be quite challenging. And it is a common deficit seen with this population. And you know what's so challenging about it? Most of the time, they could just give a flip about information. That's the thing. And I've seen now some curricula, I gotta tell you, I don't really like the way they set it up. Now, it's a good start. There's not a ton of research. Now, here the research literature is actually relatively small. So, you know, do some more. There are a lot of questions out there about questions, having to ask questions. Information oftentimes doesn't function as a reinforcer. So you'll get that really fun, like super rote responding. Say, what do you like? What do you like? Well, I like spaghetti. What do you like? I like hamburgers. And then you get that. And then you go and you do it again. What do you like? I like hamburgers. Say, what do you like? What do you like? I like spaghetti. Good job. Right? Have you seen it before? And it looks kind of weird, right? Yeah. So our job, and this is where thinking about contriving the MO gets interesting and I think fun and challenging, is we need to make information valuable to the learner. You've got to connect that information to something that's established as a reinforcer, that's already meaningful, at least initially, when you're teaching demands for information. Okay, so let's get into it. This is not one of the first studies was conducted in the late 70s, but I'm going to start again. I'm going to review the more contemporary literature. This was a pretty famous study by Taylor and Harris. I'm sure some of you have heard of Bridget Taylor, right? Let me hear your voice. She was the. Oh, there you go. So she's done a few good things, and she did this study, and they wanted to teach kids with autism to just seek information, and then. So they did a series of 3 experiments. They wanted to teach kids how to ask, what's that, in the presence of novel visual stimuli. Okay. So what they did in the first experiment is they presented 4 picture cards, provided the instruction, tell me what you see. Participants would have to point to the cards and tag the picture, emit the demand, what's that? Okay, it's a nice setup, actually. And they'd have to ask, what's that, in the presence of the unknown picture. So let's look at experiment number 1. And then they'd give them the information. And it looks like it worked pretty clearly, right? So they just give them this, say, what's that, and they tell them, and there you go. Pretty clear outcomes, right? But what they did then is in this second experiment, they wanted to, after the sessions, they wanted to see if they could receptively identify. So after I teach you what it is, do you know what it is, in a sense? So if I teach you to ask what is that, and I tell you what it is, do you eventually learn what it is? Because that's important. That's a meaningful response. So, as you can see, for Mary, Russell, and Jack, okay, these are the receptive tests and the expressive tests, the tests, right, asking them to label things. You see with Mary, she had a great receptive repertoire, great expressive. With Russell, we got great receptive and expressive, and Jack as well. So it's effective in terms of it expanded to other repertoires. That's the nice thing right there. And then in the third experiment, what they wanted to do, and this was interesting because I want you to listen carefully to what I'm telling you. Okay, this is what they did. They decided, okay, we want to see if there's generalization from experiment 1, where they taught them what's that. So they decided, okay, we're going to bait the environment at school with a bunch of like really weird stuff where it shouldn't be, like a gumball machine in the bathroom. And we want to see if when we approach those things, they ask, what's that? And here's the reinforcer. Listen carefully. The reinforcer was praise, information, and then a tangible item. Now, a tangible item. Okay, so this is what they got. Oh, okay. They didn't get, see in here in baseline? This is the check for generalization. Russell looked like he did a great job when they walked around the school. But for Jack and Mary, there was not much generalization. So they actually had to reteach the response, which they also reinforced, again, with a tangible and the information. Okay. And they speculate a few reasons for this. Some people just say it was under discriminative control. In other words, if I'm walking around with you and then I stop in front of something, that functions as an SD. In other words, the learner kind of goes, oh, okay, now I have to do that thing. What should really influence the response? You look at some weird thing and be like, what's that? Right? That should influence the response. Nevertheless, it was a great study because it was sort of the first to really talk about MANs and MOs in the context of teaching kids to man for information, right? And they acquired additional verbal behavior. Okay. So one of the things when I talk about this literature, it's my tendency, because I just did a lit review for this too, is showing sort of the evolution of this research, because it's relatively new. People started to think about MANs better and better over time as people started writing more about MANs or motivating operations over time. Now, in this study, they taught 2 4-year-old girls to emit 3 MANs. So they'd sit in front of the girls, they'd have a box with something exciting inside, and they taught them to say, what is that? Can I see it? And can I have it? Okay. Now, if you really think about it, only the first one in that chain is a man for information, which is fine. They wanted to see, right? What is that? It's a doll. Can I see it? Sure. Can I have it? Here you go. Those are the answers. Now, here's what's interesting. When they taught the response, they taught it one at a time. So what happened is they would say, what is that? And at first, in teaching it, they'd say, it's a doll, and take the doll out and hand it to the child. Think about that for a second, though. Think about it as a consequence. Then, when they taught the second man, so then they tagged the second one on. So it's, what is that? Can I see it? So when they got to the second one, the child would say, what is that? It's a doll. Can I see it? Of course. And they take the doll out and hand it to the child. Do you see where this is going? Okay. And then, when they folded in the third one, then they would say, what is that? It's a doll. Can I see it? Sure. Can I have it? Okay. Now what happened was, though, is they asked, and it was a sort of a good question is, are these really functionally independent? Are these meaningful, 3 separate meaningful questions? Or, because of the way it was taught, access to the terminal reinforcer each time, is this just really a chain of responses to get the doll? In other words, is this functionally one giant chain of responding for doll? Does that make sense? Because of the way they provided those consequences. So what this study did is it makes you really think about how to set up and provide consequences in a way that you're really kind of teaching functionally distinct responses. Now the thing is they knew that that happened. They knew that that was a possibility, right? So they said, is this a chain of responses or functionally the same man over and over again for doll? So what they did, well, I'll show you the data. It takes a second for this to pop up. Okay, here we go. Because what happened was, is they'd see, what's that? Can I see it? Can I have it? And then after they'd introduce a third one, they'd see a drop in the second one, right, in the second man. And so they said, ooh, the kid's just going right for it. The kid's saying, basically, I want a doll. So they said, okay, all right, let's do something else. So they followed up with another study. It's a systematic replication of this one. Now, what would you do if you suspected something's a chain, if 3 questions are a chain? What would you do procedurally to see if that was the case? Okay, I like all of it. It sounds good. You can change the order. Although, can I have it? What is that? What did you say, though? Change it? Yeah, change the consequence. Can I have it? No. No, really. Sometimes I might say no. Or sometimes, and that's a good recommendation, they started giving them things that were undesirable. Can I have it? Sure. And that started changing things up. So what they did is they replicated, but they started varying. They started saying no. They started delivering undesirable items. And there you go. What I want you to focus on, we have sessions here, questions here. We've got, what's that? Can I see it? Can I have it? right? They got their response, high levels, and then this is saying no to can I see it? We see a drop off, as we should. Right? If I keep on saying no to you, after a while, you're going to be like, fine. Obviously, I cannot see this, right? Do you see how the consequences? Unpleasant objects to can I see it to can I have it? We see a drop off. So because different consequences produce sort of different or varying levels of responding, now they determined, okay, these are 3 distinct questions, or mans for information, or mans, only one man for information. Very clever. And what I want you to get from this is just thinking about if you're ever teaching kind of man after man after man, or you're doing a sequence of things, really think about how you provide the consequences. And think about varying your consequences. All right, so Sundberg. So here's what's important about this study. Sundberg and his colleagues were the first people to actually talk about the motivating operation as the primary independent variable, strangely enough, in a man for information study. And so what they did is they just wanted to teach 2 children how to ask where and who. Right? And so what they did is they did a preference assessment. I don't know if they did a structured preference assessment. I think they did some observation to find preferred items and neutral items. So it wasn't a structured preference assessment, and that's something to keep in mind because they wanted to compare the effects of preference on a rate of acquisition. And they did a procedure in which they would give the child simply a bag, and they'd be like, your doll is in there. Open the bag and play with it. So the kid would be like, yes. And they contrive the MO. They would just give him an empty bag. Your doll's in there. Play with it. The kid would look, it's empty, and there's the MO. Where's my doll? Right? Okay. Okay. So now here's the where man. You see nothing in baseline, great. They contrive the MO, they remove the item from the bag, and we have acquisition of both the neutral and preferred items. Here, the viewmaster's preferred over the neutral items, so we see a little bit faster rate of acquisition. Here, presumably the frog was a more preferred item, but apparently with the cup, the child started putting the cup to his face and making those, the sounds that kids do. So the MO was there. It's like, this is cooler than a frog. Either way, we see that using this, missing items, is a nice way to contrive the MO. So the child will look in the bag and say, where is it? Or where's the frog? And then the child eventually learned to emit those mans for information. And this is just one with Joey. And what I want you to show is Joey already had the where for both preferred and non-preferred, and then successfully taught who. So the child would emit, where is it? And they'd say, one of your teachers has it. And then teach from there, say, who has it? Okay? And you can see this is the same successfully taught to man who using this technique. Okay, it takes a second for it to go over. Now, Endicott and Higby, they conducted a replication of the Sundberg study. They targeted the same mans, where and who, but they used a younger population, these preschoolers with autism in the classroom setting, and they included a structured preference assessment to identify hierarchy. So that's what they did a little bit different. A little bit of younger population, does it work? If there's younger kids, and if we use a structured preference assessment, does preference differentially affect rate of acquisition? Right? So there it is. I think these are pretty clear results. These are the high preference, the lower preference items. During intervention, we see acquisition of both. So they did the same thing. They hid items. And then with follow-up or generalization probes, they were still able to emit demand for information. And it looks like they were doing in the presence of lower preferred and high preferred item, which is a good thing. You should be able to demand for information across both. And this is just for who, and it successfully shows that the intervention produced responding, a nice consistent responding. Okay. Okay, this next one actually, this is what this is what I want you to get for the next study. Now the graph is a little bit maddening. But here's what I the reason why I wanted to include this, I went back and forth and back and forth. But what they wanted to do in this study is they wanted to conduct a study in which they used an echoic prompt and hidden items, okay, to teach the aware man for information in a structured setting. So they used a private cubicle. And then what they did is they wanted to probe for generalization to less structured settings. Okay, so they used 3 preschool-age children with a diagnosis of autism. Training was conducted in a private cubicle. And the participant was told to retrieve the item. Let's play Get This, okay? And then generalization probes were conducted prior to and after the training phase. Generalization probes were conducted with novel toys in the training settings, novel toys in novel settings, and using behavior change during which the verbal instruction, get this, was not presented. And here's what I just want you to focus on. What I want you to focus on is, whoops, sorry, not that. That they saw generalization across settings. So they did it. They got to novel settings, cool. They got to novel items, wonderful. But they didn't get it in the absence of the instruction. And one of the reasons why I bring that up is that what they said, the authors speculate that the original man was emitted under partial interverbal control. In other words, partly what was controlling a response is the teacher coming out and saying, get this. Is it ideal? Because that's not what should be, right, influencing their response. So that's why they did not emit demand in the absence of the instructions. And what I want you to know is that the study highlights the importance of probing for generalization across a variety of stimuli and contexts. So when you think of probing for generalization, think beyond probing just physical spaces and items. If it looks different, if I'm not giving you instructions anymore, are you still emitting demand? And if not, then it's not really under the right control of the appropriate or the relevant MO. And you got to go back and think about how you're going to get it under there. Does that make sense? The thing that gets dicey about teaching this stuff is that it can come under what people call faulty stimulus control. Some people don't like that term. Inappropriate stimulus control. In the end, you want to make sure that it's happening at the right times for the right reasons. And so especially when you do man for information stuff, you want to have a lot of checks and controls in there for that. And when I get to the recommendations part, I'll talk about how to do that. So, I know this study. Okay. So this is what I wanted to know. Mans are under the influence of MOs. And we know the research at this point says, okay, they generalize across instructional agents, they generalize across new items and locations. But my question was, do they generalize across MOs? I mean, that's kind of a fundamental question about mans for information, right? So we had 3 participants. I targeted the same ones, where and who. But what I did also in this study is I introduced the control chain. And the reason I introduced the control chain, well, let me explain a little bit procedurally what I did. So if you think about it, you have to select chains. If you're going to do it across MOs, that means that your missing target has to be the same item, but they need it for different reasons, which is actually really hard to think about. So I had chains for like a volcano chain, because I always use volcano chains. They need a spoon to scoop the baking soda. Then there was an ice cream chain. They use a spoon to eat. The spoon doll chain, they use a spoon to make a doll and play. And so I used different activities. Same missing item, it was a spoon, but they need it, the MO is different, they need it for different reasons. And then I included a control chain in which it was just a totally different activity that did not use the target item, the spoon. And here's why. I made something else missing, like I had a puzzle in which I removed one of the puzzle pieces. And the reason why I did that is I wanted to check to see if they said, where's spoon, in the context of the control chain. Because they did, well, then we got a problem. Because what that means to me is, what that might mean is that I have a response under inappropriate stimulus control. Yep. But it's a good check. Always have a check, right? So here are the outcomes. Okay. So this is one of my participants. This is John. these are the 3 activities. I'm testing for generalization across EOs here. Our target is the spoon. So this is the who. Who has the spoon, right? And so after training with 1, of course, we got steady responding after training. We saw generalization 2 across EOs. And with him, he had pretty decent verbal repertoire. He asked, who has the truck? Great. That's what I want to see. Not who has the spoon, but who has the truck. Okay. Now this guy did something interesting. He had a more frail repertoire. He was more of a beginner. We targeted spoon, volcano, of course. We interviewed on volcano. We got responding. We actually got generalization across EOs. And then he's the one with the puzzle piece. Where spoon, where 4? He called it a 4 because it looked like a 4. It was totally accidental that it looked like a 4, but he called it 4. I thought that's clever. But he did this. He said, the piece is missing. He said, where's spoon? And then I went, and then he went, 4. Okay, that was good. I'm so glad he did that. I think I might have kissed the top of his head. I was like, yes, right? And what that indicated to me is that the relevant MO was in place. He meant it directly for the item. He just had a little bit more trouble slipping it into a frame. The other 2 participants didn't because they could already ask where is. He had no history of MANs. He didn't have those MANs for information. This was his first one, so he didn't quite do it as well. And I talk a little bit about how to conceptualize that. But what I want you to take away from this paper is have a control. Because you want to look for generalization across EOs and items, and you want to have that control just to make sure that they're saying the man you're targeting under the right circumstances. Okay? All right. We're at 11:21. Okay. All right, so these folks conducted a study. They taught 2 boys with language delays man for information using a script fading procedure. So they used scripts. They targeted the where man. They used audio taped scripts. The main focus of the study was to examine and compare the effects of EO and AO conditions. Okay, AO is the abolishing operation. So in other words, and you should do this in practice, when you present chains to contrive the motivating operation, like for where, for example, make sure that you intersperse chains in which all the items are present and they have no reason to ask. It's another form of control. Because if they have all the items they need, but emit the man, then again it helps you identify, whoops, we have the man not quite under the right control of the right stuff. Okay. The script training procedure was successful. They got full script. Now these are all prompted responses. Then they went to partial script and faded out to no script and got independent responding. And as you can see, what I want you to note is the open squares are when the item present or the AO trials, you see, never manded during those AO trials. And then they got generalization and maintenance, but here we have some possibly faulty stimulus control, but there was very little manding under AO trials, and that's what you want to see. They did not mand when the items were present. They shouldn't. Always have a control. All right. So in this study, Schillingsberg and her colleagues conducted a study, and actually they tackled a ton of MANs for information. It was rather impressive. I remember actually I reviewed this paper. And it was who, when, which. It was who, when, where, and which. And when can be hard for some learners, right? They have to have some skills, some prereqs to make when work. But they compared the effects of teaching, this is interesting, specific MO, or specific MANs to general MANs. So what they want to know is, if I just teach you how to say where, will I see generalization? And if I teach you how to say where are the headphones, will I see generalization? They wanted to compare the effectiveness of doing those 2 things. Now, this is what she found. This is a who scenario. This is all one participant. Okay, this is Cameron, who with a general response and a general response. So when they intervened, they got generalization. This is a where scenario with a specific response. They intervened. They did not get generalization. See, they had to present treatment again. They taught where using a specific response. They intervened, and they did not get generalization. They taught when using a general response, and they did get intervention. So basically, the bottom line is if you teach a general response, you're more likely to get generalization than if you teach a specific response. I recommend, but I'm going to tell you this right now, and I love Alice, and they produce amazing research. Don't do that. I'm going to tell you to teach specific response, because here's the problem. What if you're somewhere and someone goes up to you and goes, "Where?" What are you going to say? It's like kind of effectively like teaching the more response, more, and you have parents in tears because they're like, more what? More what? What? More should mean more. My recommendation still is to teach full frames. You still get generalization. You can get generalization with full frames with a specific response. Teach them how to be specific, because what that does is it broadens their pool of receptive listeners. If you ask me, "Where is my Play-Doh?" I can help you. If you come up to me, "Where?" I can't. Unless the learner is, or unless the audience or the listener is right there observing the learner. But that's not life. That doesn't work. It doesn't work like that, right? So Alice, they produce a lot of amazing man for information research. And they were the first to actually publish an article on teaching the how man for information. It's really weird to me that it wasn't until 2011 research on this was published. This is the first research study on it. We started at the same time. Mine was a little longer. It's getting published now, right? But there's like two of us, maybe like three now. Another one of Alice's on how. But how is very interesting. They were the first to examine how just one young boy with autism. What they basically use is multiple activities that produce a desirable outcome that the participant couldn't complete himself. Okay? Because I want to create an MO for how. If you know how to do something, you shouldn't ask how. Right? They wanted to see how much direct training is required before they saw generalization. So these are the outcomes. Pretty clear. You couldn't do it. They intervened on 2 chains, and then there was generalization to 4 other chains. So it was an effective way to teach the how man for information. So he would try. They say how. He says how. They tell him how. He finishes it out. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to teach how in more detail. So we did just finish another how study. It's about to come out. Oh, I don't need to look at that. I know what we did. This is what I wanted to do. She just taught just the how. So I said, no, I want to teach the full frame. So we targeted 2 types of how. How do I activity and how many. And I wanted to look at 2 things. I wanted to look at, with full frames, am I going to see generalization across activities? So topographically different responses and different MOs. And just for fun, because it's an experiment, I wanted to see what would happen when I taught who first. And I could go on about this study, so I'm going to stop myself so I have enough time. But I taught how do I, and then I just probed after they mastered how do I to see what happened with the how many. And some very interesting stuff happened, which I can't really get into detail. I will if we have time. But that's what I wanted to know. Those 2 man frames, full frames, do I get generalization across those frames and within frames across activities? We also used chains of activities. You know, and I've got to tell you, I'm not even going to lie. Behavior chains are an extremely effective way to contrive the MO, but they are not easy to find. So build a bank of stuff, because you have to figure out what your learner likes. Okay, this is all Jake. This is all the how do I. I also did follow-up to see the response maintained a couple of weeks later, and this is how many, and then here's my control. So a control is a chain that produces a desirable outcome but that they can perform. Always have your control, right? But presumably in the control, the open data path denotes independent completion of the chain. The closed data path denotes manned. So here's what happened with Jake. I intervened on Volcano, of course Volcano, because it's the best chain. He learned right away. 1 trial. He was so bright. I told him, and then he got it after that. This is why when you teach how, you want to have many chains and some with multiple steps to make it challenging. Because if your learner acquires in 1 trial, then you're out for teaching trials and probing trials after that. That's the difficulty with how. Once you know how, you're not going to ask how. You shouldn't, right? So then we had to intervene on the magic trick, which is way harder. I taught him how to saw a lady in half. He consistently admitted the man. It was very cute. You'll see some video of it. And then we got some generalization to making an origami bear head. Very, very hard, but he really liked doing it. We see in the follow-up, so during baseline, of course, he did not admit in the man, and then he consistently admitted the man during follow-up. Of course, there was no generalization. I didn't expect it to how many. But I would say, if you want to celebrate the birthday party and have a piece of cake, you got to tell me how many candles, or you got to tell me the number of candles. And they would have to say how many. And he said, how do I make a birthday party? Oh, but that was very interesting. I talked a lot about that because I think it's a very interesting response. So we intervened on 1, and we see generalization across 2. In the follow-up, you'll see nothing in baseline and nice consistent responding for how many here. But look at control. He could put on his jacket by himself. And as you can see right here, he's putting on his jacket. And in the last 2, he doesn't. He doesn't put on his jacket, and he mans. And here's what happened. So he's doing his thing. So I'm working on my data. I'm fine. Last second to the last session, he says, how do I put on my jacket? And I said, what? What? And I turned around, but the zipper is jacked up. And I was like, oh, that's great. Because it's another instance of generalization. The MO really was there. And it was also messed up. I'm streaming live. I should be more. It was not functioning properly. and this is the last 2. So the MO, in essence, was there. Yeah. It was neat to see that. And then the final study that I want to talk about, okay, and I have some time, I'm getting kind of, my student just completed this study. We're about to submit this for publication. So she wanted to target what? She wanted to do 2 things. Up until now, in the research literature, when teaching individuals with autism to demand for information, what's that? We've taught them to do it in the presence of novel visual stimuli. So I said, well, 2 things. Let's compare what it looks like. Let's try and contrive an EO present and EO absent condition when teaching and actually directly compare the effects, which is kind of hard to do, and I'll explain how I did it in a second, and see if that differentially affects the rate of acquisition. And the second thing I wanted to know, or we wanted to know, was if I teach you how to demand what's that in the presence of novel visual stimuli, would you do it in the presence of novel auditory stimuli? If I ask you to go get something that you haven't heard of, could you tell me then what's that? Do you, in a sense, get that asking what's that means I don't understand stimulus? I just wanted to know. And we have some interesting outcomes. So I'm only going to show you the outcomes for one of our participants because that's all I got. I'll show you what we did. I know it's a lot. I'm sorry about this. I know it hurts a little bit. So I'm just going to walk you through it. I'm just going to tell you what you need to know. Okay. This is, if I can even see it now, goodness gracious. All right. What she started off with, this is one participant, okay? We can actually have some stuff. Now, what she did is she wanted to do it kind of the Taylor and Harris style. So she identified pictures that they could tact and pictures they couldn't tact. So the pictures they couldn't tact would be the ones that we teach the what's that response. Fair enough. Okay. So she would put them on the table, tell me what you see on the table. They had to do the same thing, tact, and when they got to the one they didn't know, they would have to say, what's that? So here's what an EO present condition looked like. If the EO is present, what she would do is after the tact, or after the man, she would say, it's whatever. It's a chair. And immediately afterwards, she'd represent the cards, and she'd say, tell me what you see on the table, to give the opportunity to the participant to tact correctly. Because tacts in EO present produced chocolate. It is an established reinforcer. So it's EO present because she's connecting information directly to an established reinforcer. In the EO absent condition, she did the same thing except, right? So when they manded, she would say, it's a chair, and then she would do the same thing, except this time tacts did not produce access to chocolate. She would give chocolate throughout the session to kind of yoke for that. for sitting well, so on and so forth, but she didn't give a contingent on correct tacting. So do you see the difference? In the EO absent condition, tact, knowing the name of something, was not related to the desirable outcome, which is chocolate. In the EO present condition, it was related to gaining access to chocolate. So what we'll see here, she wanted to also look at the effects. We're looking at a lot of stuff. And do they actually learn the tact? Because over time, what you'd expect to see is an increase in tact and a decrease in what's that. That's ideally what I want to say. I don't want you to keep on asking me, what's that, what's that, what's that, and not, in essence, learn what that is. And then she wanted to compare the effects across items, pictures that a child knew, and as a control, pictures the child didn't know. Because we got to always have your control. You got to have your control. So these are the unknowns, the ones with the squares. You see? She's looking at different right here. These are three different participants. And these are unknowns. Right, so they should be manding here, and they should just be tacting here and manding, and not manding here with known items, right? You don't expect them to say, what's that with known items? You see? Known items. It should be a lot of tacting. This was an interesting case. Known items. A lot of tacting, no mans. Does that make sense? If they know the picture, they shouldn't be asking. Here's what happened here, poor Marion. It was crayon. She was saying crayon, and then she said Crayola, and they'd say no, and she's like, what's that? And in essence, that's an EO. It's actually really making her very angry. And I don't blame her, because it's sort of right. It's Crayola. So it's very interesting, but we had to be kind of consistent with our response, expectations. We're like, no, it's crayon. Poor thing's like, what's that? What's that? And she has a long history of, of clinical services. So and for her, also being right did start to function as a reinforcer. It was kind of sad. Just get upset, poor thing. But here's what I want you to see. That here we have EO absent condition. We see some mans in the acquisition of the tact, and then with prompting, we don't have as swift generalization. I know that's so hard to see. Then they have EO present condition, and then when they did the probes, we have swifter generalization. We could see this a little bit easier with Marion. Let's see. We have the mans, then an increase in tacts and a concomitant decrease in mans, and then we see a nice little steady increase in independent responding when probed for generalization. Then we taught under EO present conditions, and we see quicker generalization of the response. So here's the takeaway message. We saw an increase in responding using, really for both. We got the man for things that were when we had an EO absent condition. And it really is, the challenge is it's very hard to make something purely EO present or EO absent. But what we did notice is that there is a greater rate of acquisition or better generalization when you have an EO present condition. Now, interestingly, in terms of generalization to the auditory stimuli, I think I only have Marion's. Marion was our most advanced student. So with Marion, the cool thing was we got it. We got generalization to novel auditory stimuli. Right? You see it? We got generalization to auditory stimuli. And these are 3 different activities, one with unknown and one with known. So this is the way we do it. We'd say, okay, let's make a beanbag. And then they'd be working on it together, and she'd say, get me the... And if he said, what's that? She'd pull out a picture and say, it looks like this. And he'd have to go and grab it and go to the basket full of items and pick it out. Yeah, it was fun. There's some prerequisites you think about. You need to have a learner who has 3D to 2D matching, right? But it was it was fun. It was fun being creative, trying to think of how to do this experimentally. And it just gives a good idea for clinical practice. So that's a good way maybe to contrive to test for banding in the presence of novel auditory stimuli. So of course we had to also say known items to control, right? Tell him or her to get me something that I know he or she knows how to identify, just to make sure. So it did generalize. For the other two participants, however, there was no generalization to novel auditory stimuli. So here's my recommendation for practicing with MANs for information. Do not assume generalization across establishing operations, and don't assume across different modalities and different stimuli. Just because I teach what's that in the presence of auditory novel visual stimuli doesn't mean that it's going to happen in the presence of novel auditory stimuli. It might. Probe for it, and then you'll know, right? Because what happens, common clinical practice or recommendation is to teach one under the influence of one EO. Now we see that that's a supported practice, but always probe. Always probe. All right. So let's talk about teaching MANs for information. We can do this. I've got 20 minutes, right? Yes? Okay. It's going to happen. This takes a minute. All right. So sometimes what I get is, which MANs do I target first? I like to start with these first. What, where, who, how. When and why are awesome. Don't not target them. But there is less research, and it might be more challenging to teach. These are harder. There's nothing on why yet. I'm going to do this. The more I said it, I'm like, yeah, let's do this. Let's see what happens. But think about contriving the MO for why. So today I'm going to focus on teaching procedures for what, where and who, and how. Okay. These, by the way, are great curricula and books to refer to for setting up sessions for teaching MANs for information, by the way. This is offered online. They can see this, right? Mm-hmm. Online. Okay. Good. So this is what I want you to think about. When you think about especially teaching MANs for information, really MANs, but MANs for information, I want you to think about layers of motivation. And this is where that word condition motivating operation, the transitive CMO, comes into place. Okay? So I'm going to quiz you on this. Here's the definition. It's an environmental variable related to the relation between another stimulus and some form of reinforcement, and thus establishes the reinforcing effectiveness of the other stimulus and evokes all behavior that's produced that stimulus. Good? No. All right. It's a bit wordy, isn't it? This is what I want you to think about. One stimulus establishes another related stimulus as a reinforcer. That's it. So, for example, you got a bowl of ice cream. Okay, you may be hungry and ice cream deprived. I've got some MO there. Now, if you need ice cream, the MO is for ice cream, but you also need a spoon to eat it, don't you? So now spoon may function as a reinforcer. Now there's another MO for spoon. Does that make sense? Because that's the only way you're going to get that ice cream, right? That ice cream also establishes sort of the need for spoon. Now spoon becomes the reinforcer. You see how the spoon is related to the desirable outcome? Relate the information to an established reinforcer, making that information valuable. Oh, okay, so we have a video here. So I've got to hit escape. No. Okay. This is just a quick when. I'm not going to cover this, like I said, but just.
Can I please have my juice? You can have it in the wall. Say when in 5 seconds. Okay. Squirrels, they're chasing. That was good waiting. Here's
Yeah,
the
forget it.
juice.
Yes. What's happening now? There's so much drama in this presentation. All right, so do you see what she did? Now, when you're starting to teach when, if you have a learner who can monitor time, sometimes you might want to use a timer. A time timer is great because it has that red that they can see. Start off with, you can have it in 2 seconds. You can have it an hour. That's not going to play out, right? You can have it right now. You can have it in 2 seconds, and then you can expand the time. Can I keep going? Ah. Okay. Thank you. I'm just going to shove this in my pocket. There we go. All right. All right. The where, who, and how. Select activities that produce a desirable outcome to your learner. I'm telling you, pro volcano chain. They will really like it. Tornado water is also a really good one. Yeah? That's a volcano. These are just examples. With how you select those chains, begin just by observing the kinds of activities your learner enjoys. Does your learner enjoy playing on the computer? Well, then maybe, you press the power button, you log on, and you get to the program. Well, maybe you just don't do that anymore. Right? Asking caregivers, and then just exposure to that's what I did for a lot of my studies. They didn't have exposure to a volcano, so I'm like, let's try it out. And then I just observed the way there's more. I want to do it again. I like it. To the point in baseline where I got some crying. They couldn't finish activities. It was a little sad because it was, how do I? And then you don't say anything. The kid's just struggling. Help. You stare at the child and you pull all the toys away. And my little kid, my poor research assistants were struggling with this one. You'll see him in a video. It was very cute. And he'd go, oh, well, maybe next time. But I'll tell you what to do. If you're going to collect baseline, I'm actually going to give you some tips on what to do so that your learner doesn't become too frustrated or disinterested, because you can kill the MO if you keep on dangling the carrot and then yanking it away. You don't want to be mean, right? You want to select multiple activities, one's for teaching and one's for probing. You want to probe for generalization always. Okay, so for teaching who and where, I might teach an activity using a chaining procedure. For example, volcano. I'll remove the spoon. I'll give the instruction, make a volcano. Allow the learner to seek the item from 1 to 2 seconds. I like to let my learners seek the item. Why? Because I want them to know it's missing. Because I want the response to come under the control of, oh, it's not here. If there's no man, then I provide the prompt. Say, where's the spoon? That produces information. It's in the red box. If I get an independent demand, I give the information. Give the information. Provide the information and not the item itself. Don't provide the item itself. Don't provide a tangible. Don't provide the item. Provide the information. Just make sure that information is tied to a desirable outcome. Does that make sense? Okay. That's a big one, though. I'll see people providing it. I say, no. Because what you're functionally teaching is a demand for the item. What you want to teach is a man for information. That's different. Now we're going to look at a couple man for information videos here. Oh, wait. Did I do it wrong? Okay. Why is it not doing it? Okay. Can I just... Okay, you don't see the struggle here. Okay, that's good. Videos 2 and 3. Okay. This is just an example of where they didn't use an activity chain. They did it like the Sunberg style, missing item from the bag. So she was giving her a little pony in her bag.
Where's my pony? It's in the microwave. Not again. I keep flying. Where's your pony?
This is just a quick who.
Here you go, Ella. Where is it? Someone has it. Say, who has it? Who has it? Mommy has it. Lollipop, eat it. Eat it.
Yes. Desirable outcome. Tie it to a desirable outcome. That was clearly very desirable for her. All right. All right. So where are the layers of motivation? I keep on talking about the transitive CMO. The layer 1 is the erupting volcano. That's the one that's near and dear to your learner's heart. That's the one that matters. That's the driving force. Technically, it's called the proximal MO. But you need a spoon to get there. So now there is an MO for spoon. It's established as a reinforcer. And when that spoon is gone, now information about that spoon's location functions as a reinforcer. Does that make sense? Okay. Awesome. Always relate the information to an established reinforcer. That's just going to keep popping up. All right. Now, there's some special considerations for the how man. You need to use activities in this case that they cannot complete independently, right? That's the reason why they ask how, right? You're probably going to need more activities than when you're teaching the where and the who, because where, I can use the same one over and over again. I just hide the item. But with how, once they learn that item, that chain's out. It becomes a control chain if I want it to, right? So you need to have multiple activities as backup. Use activities of multiple steps. Make them hard ones. I use things like kid origami, card tricks, things like that. Because you're going to need them to teach, to probe for generalization, and then a control, right? Something they can complete independently. That's what the control chain is, right? An activity with a desirable outcome that they can complete independently. So in teaching how, I might just tell you, make a volcano. I allow the attempt because I want them to fail. I want them to come into contact with not being able to produce the behaviors to finish the chain, right? They complete activity independently, well, then they get access to the terminal reinforcer. If they mand independently, I provide the information that gets them access to the terminal reinforcer. If they don't mand, then I just provide a prompt. They give them information for imitating that prompt, which gives them access to the reinforcer. So let's look at, this is my little guy. Okay, I have to do this. Okay.
Time to make magic?
Okay, that's me.
Let's make magic.
I look
Yeah?
terrible.
Okay. Saw a lady in half.
This one?
So he could do the first step, which he had to draw a lady. It's very fun to do this trick.
Oh, that's true.
Whoops. I'll take that. Thank you.
How I saw the lady in
Well, let's see. Take the scissors. Do you remember what you do now? You cut. You cut both ends.
What was neat about this participant is that he started to
now click the other side.
Mm-hmm.
say the steps to himself.
Put the scissors down.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so in looking at sort of the layers of motivation for the how man for information, we have, again, the proximal reinforcer, the terminal one, which is the erupting volcano. That's the one that's near and dear to the learner's heart. But if you don't know how to do that, how to make a volcano, that makes information about how to do it function as a reinforcer. Does that make sense? You must relate the information to establish reinforcer. Now, this is important. You need to control for the MO. And I keep on talking about control chains because you just need it as just a check. Are they saying it under the right conditions, right? So for where and who, once in a while you're going to want to present the activities with all the items present. Okay? And that means that they will have no reason to mand. And if they do, you can start doing a little tweaking and working in there. Okay? If you're going to do an experiment or run a baseline in which you present the items repeatedly, but you take them away because they can't mand, rotating in presentation of the activity with all the items is also a good way to keep them becoming frustrated. Because if they repeatedly fail, you may reduce the reinforcing value of engaging in that chain, right? It'd be pretty frustrating if someone kept on enticing you with something. You didn't know how to do it, and then they refuse to help you. After a while, just presenting that item to you might be like, you know what, not this again. So it's good to rotate in completed activities with all the items present for both of those reasons. For how chains, What you can do once in a while, what I do, and I recommend you do, is complete the activity out of the learner's view, and then allow them to contact the reinforcer. So do all you need to do for the volcano chain, and then let them watch the volcano explode. And you need to rotate in the control activity. Okay. Why do I want to do that? Because I want to make sure that repeated presentation doesn't reduce the reinforcing value of it. I also want to make sure that you still like it, right? Because if after a while you don't really respond positively to an erupting volcano, I'm probably going to chuck it because it doesn't matter much to you. Right? Rotate in that control activity. That's the one that has a desirable outcome, but that they know how to perform independently. That way you can make sure, oops, if they emit demand then, I may need to go back and tweak. Right? So in teaching what, this is the last one. You can, for example, identify pictures of known to get some established known and unknown pictures. Present 2 to 3 pictures. Do it of the known items first just to get them to kind of get the activity down. Tell me what you see on the table. This and this, great job. This and this, great job. Right? So it kind of looked like this. I'd say, what do you see on the table? They say ball. Make them point to it. Dog. Flower. A correct tact should produce access to some established reinforcer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to present 1 to 2 knowns and 1 unknown. They're presumably going to tact. I'm going to say, tell me what you see on the table. They presumably tact the one that they know. And if the unknown one, if they tact it, well, they know it. They get access to the established reinforcer. If they emit an independent man, what's that? I give them information. I tell them the name of the item. If there's no response, I provide the prompt, what's that? Which gets them the name of the item. And then I'm going to represent the same pics to give them an opportunity to tact again. This is the important part right here. A correct tact should produce access to the established reinforcer. A correct man should produce information. And no response should produce a prompt. Okay? So let's look at that's what's that?
What do you see on the table?
She says, what do you see on the table?
Chair. That's not chair.
He attempted to tact when he got it wrong. She just simply said, that's not that.
David, you ready? What are we going to work
She's going to present a known and unknown.
Yeah, we're going to work for chocolate, all right?
He's going to work for
Come
chocolate.
on, ready. No. There you go. Tell me what you see on the table. Cookies, that's that.
He said, what's that?
Look. Tell me what you see on the table. Cookies. Look. Wow.
Okay,
nice
so do you
job.
see that? First she gave the information, then the opportunity to tact. When he got the tact correct, she gave him the chocolate.
Say, yes, I am.
Did he ask what's that?
He did. He did. He went, what's that?
Did she answer him?
Yeah,
Okay,
he
sorry.
did. No, I know. Because he'd go, what's that? So it's a little bit.
And then she answered him, and then when he said cookie, she gave him.
So what she did is she answered him. I don't know what it was. It was some kind of device. And then right after that, so she told him what it was. It's a, let's just say it's spatula is what she said, because I couldn't hear very well either. So it's a spatula. And then right afterwards, she said, tell me what you see on the table. And he said cookie, and then named it correctly, then gave him the chocolate. See, and that's the key. That's the distinction. So you shouldn't get the chocolate for manding for information, only for tacting correctly. Yeah? Okay, that's a good question. I know, it's that high pitch. What's that? So take home points for MANs and Man for Information training. Use preferred items and activities. Select a prompt and prompt fading system and implement systematically and consistently. MANs, after a few single words, go for the MAN frames. Man for Information, teach the full frame. Teach the specific response. With MANs, you reinforce by providing the activity that they manded for, or for which they manded. For MANs for Information, you give information, and you tie that information to an established reinforcer. Be consistent with the response requirements. practice in multiple locations, multiple people, in multiple times per day in structured and unstructured settings. Manding should happen all the time. Think about a typical child. How much does a typical child mand? Near constantly, right? I think we did it just in the nick of time. Whew. I think that's it. We have to lunch now, don't we?
We are.
Okay, here's. I do have a recommendation. I don't know if any of you have done this. There's a great tutorial on foxylearning. It's either org. It's Foxy Learning, all one word. FOXYLEARNING. .org or .com. It might be a .org. Okay, on there they offer a lot of great resources, but there's a verbal behavioral tutorial. He's known for his instructional technology stuff. It's wildly good. It's exceptionally good. I like starting off with all my students and people who are going to work in the clinic. They have to go through this tutorial. It's fantastic. It helps. Verbal behavior is very complex. This is a phenomenal tutorial. You can actually take it for CEUs, which is about like $50 or $60. Or you can do it for $9, no CEUs. Yeah. Is it .com? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Yes.
I need that, where is that, how do you, at some point I can see them working as frames of each other. You know, for example, when the child is an adult, in the work setting, they say, I need blah, blah, blah. They're also asking where is it possibly, and the person isn't going to say, you know, say where is it, so just tell them where it is.
Yeah.
So, and that, they sort of function as frames of each other once they've learned.
Well, you can do, I mean, and that's a really great question. It's like once they get a frame, because there's no, as far as I know, any research on man for information frames and in producing variability, but there's research on just mans for items and producing variability. So you could try in teaching doing it the same way, which is teaching some new scripts or new ways to talk about it, because you're so very right. Here's why, because people are like, what if my child is asking for help? It's the same thing. It's like, yeah, but it's not. Because it's also a response that's not going to produce, if I'm not right there, I can't help. So the how mand is helpful because it expands, again, a responsive pool of listeners. Yeah, that's a fantastic question, absolutely. And I need this can be a mand or a mand for information. Because I might be like, okay, fine, here. Or I have that, or it's over there, yeah. Yeah, so it might be the case that you want to, when your learner's progressing through, we can get some variability in man frames. This is kind of a cool research idea. I'm thinking about it right now. How I can vary, that's kind of cool. The way I respond, and does it differentially affect? If I teach it, if I make it a man for information, will it stop being a man for the item? Like, does it hurt the responding? That's great, yeah. That's right. In a sense. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question.
Please join me in thanking
Oh. Thanks, guys.
That's your code. The code is RUS298. Thank you.
Okay, so because I'm going to be somewhere else.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can take you down there. And I don't know if you want to drop anything else.
No, I'm just going to go. I was just going to go.